Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey everyone, Steve here. I am presenting to you today the complete story of Solomon's temple, its rise, its glory, its long decline, and its ultimate destruction. Across this series, we explored how one of history's most iconic sacred buildings was built, rebuilt, and finally reduced to rubble. From its height of Solomon's golden age to the fires of Babylon, we retraced the religious, political, and archaeological threads that shaped the First Temple period. With various delays and interruptions like the short papal conclave series, which saw the election of American Pope Leo XIV, I now present the entire Solomon series in one long-form documentary. As you listen, you will see this is not just the history of a building, but of a people of faith and the beginnings of something that would last long after the last stone had fallen. In the entire show, we've talked a ton about the Second Temple of Jerusalem, rightly so. The Second Temple and the period marked by the building of the Second Temple of Jerusalem was absolutely critical to the formation of the earliest days of Christianity. The Second Temple is not the subject of today's episode, though. If there was a Second Temple, it has to be assumed that there was a First Temple. And of course, there was a First Temple. The First Temple, known as Solomon's Temple, was an incredibly important place in its own right. Temple worship in this time before the destruction of the First Temple helped to define the Israelite and the proto-Jewish religion, you might say, and what would eventually wind up being the Judean religion of the Second Temple. I want to thank longtime supporter and friend of the show, Peter the Great of the Rome Patreon level for suggesting this topic and a few other related and upcoming topics. I always appreciate Peter's emails and support. Thank you, Peter the Great, so much. Now, I also want to credit Biblical Archaeological Review, biblicalarchaeologicalreview.com, for providing many of the sources used in today's episode. Let's step back a little bit from the First Temple and talk about what are temples, period. Now, temples served several functions. The obvious and the first function is religious sacrifice. This is the central place where the gods were and are honored, the place where the gods either lived or could be visited. Now, there was a second function, which was of monumental architecture. This is the place where the king, the most important people in the ruling elites of society, would gather, and it's often a place where the wealth of a locality was stored. So it did serve a civil function as well. This is the place the building was a sink of wealth. The treasure of the liturgical artifacts was a sink of wealth. The also actual physical bullion and grain and produce could be stored in there. So it was the place where wealth was put. Temples linked the civil government, for a lack of the better words, the secular government, you might say. I mean, it's really hard to split those two. The government and the religion together, the king and the gods were linked in the temple. And the temple was this connection between the king, who represented his tribe or people, to the god. So it's kind of like the earthly king connecting up with the heavenly king. That's a powerful connection. And you can see why people wanted to put so much of their hard-earned wealth into that system, not just a building, but a whole entire system that revolved around temples. Most temples around the Eastern Mediterranean Sea region followed a similar layout, in broad strokes at least. Now you had Greek temples. Greek temples are maybe they're developing at a similar time, but then as the Solomon Temple, but probably a little bit later. But it's a good archetype because there are so many Greek temple ruins to observe. Generally, temples were rectangular buildings surrounded by lines of columns that helped support the roof. The sides were generally twice the length of the front and back. The line of columns would form an outside area that was generally called the porch, and the porch served a variety of functions. It was a meeting place, and the porch also eased people into the temple. It was a pre-sanctified space, a place to get warmed up, to get into the more sacred areas of the temple. Now, the actual interior part of the temple was enclosed by heavy walls that actually supported the roof structure. The dark interior space, because there generally weren't windows, would hold a statue or some other icon of the deity, and the interior space was where the rituals and the sacrifices to the gods were held. The holiest or most holy sacred space would have been inside of that and was generally strictly the domain of the priests. Generally, the public would have a limited or no access to that interior space. That's the short story of ancient temples in the Eastern Mediterranean area. They were, for the most part, very similar in layout, with variations, of course. The interior would have been dark, being that there weren't windows. The interior area was known as the cella, or in Latin, the naus. This area would have been lit by candles or by oil lanterns, so it would have given it a whole otherworldly feeling to it. Larger temples, in many cases, could have another temple built inside of them, and there were some gigantic temples in antiquity. There's several huge examples of huge temple complexes in Egypt. There's big temples and very ancient temples on Malta. The biggest and most important temples in the Greek world were the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus and the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, Greece. They both made Herodotus's famous top 10 ancient wonders of the world list. There was also a large temple to Apollo in Delphi. We'll get into the size of some of these temples later to compare and contrast them with Solomon's temple. These ideas tie together because the Temple of Solomon exhibited many of the functions and forms of other Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern temples and cults. So moving forward, we have to shift our thoughts on temples and the temple. Temples were not places of religious congregation like we would think of, say, a church or a synagogue or a masjid or whatever. People would congregate around the periphery of temples, but the main purpose was to get your sacrifices into the temple where a priest would do some sort of sacrificing to the gods, or God with an uppercase G, as the case may be. So in this episode, in this little series inside of a series, we'll look at how a group of semi-nomadic pastoralists developed their own traditions, then adopted and adapted to new traditions, and how this group developed an idea of a God that could not be depicted in art and who was transcendental, the so-called aniconism of the Judean religion. Issues we'll have to touch upon, but largely punt for the most part, but we'll kind of tangentially dip in and out, is how the Israelite idea of the divinity developed and evolved, particularly how the Israelites eventually went from a Canaanite group that worshiped many gods to one God, at least in theory. Textual and historiographical issues in the Old Testament in regards to temple and worship. These topics are huge, and tangential to the discussion of the first Jerusalem temple or the Temple of Solomon, but we need to at least acknowledge they're there and get a 10,000 foot view of them. We'll also discuss a few other temples to try and narrow in on what was unique about Solomon's temple and what connections it had to other temples. Let's talk a little bit about temple cultures and motifs around the ancient world. Let's start off and take a look at some other temples from around the Levant region. So a quick word on naming. We mostly talk about people living in the post-Babylonian exile world in this podcast, the Second Temple period. But now we're winding it back to the pre-exile and the world of the First Temple. When we're talking about the Second Temple of Jerusalem, it's a lot easy to refer to those people living in Judea and a few other places as Second Temple Jews. We can be really specific about peoples, places, and religions. For example, Judeans and Galileans practice Second Temple Judaism. Samaritans practice Samaritanism in Samaria. Greeks were Greeks. Romans were Romans. It gets a little trickier in the time period before the exile to be specific on naming people and religions, especially tricky as we move further back in time. During the United Kingdom of Israel, we had Judea or Judah and Israel under one kingdom. They all practiced a continuum of related Israelite versions of Canaanite religions. We can dabble into what the theology was of these various religions, and it's very complicated. It's controversial. But the short story is the Temple of Solomon was actually built in Judah. So not to split hairs, but with all of that, what terms should we use? Should we call them Hebrews? Should we call them Jews? Should we call them Judeans? Should we call them Judites? Should we call them Israelites? For our purposes, at least today, and this might evolve over time in this series, I will generally use the term Israelites when referring to the religion and the people, because it is a convenient blanket term that applies pretty accurately to describe this diverse group of people. Let's talk about a specific temple right now of the Hebrews, I guess you could call them, or the ancient Israelites, and that's the Temple of Elephantine Island. We're going to start outside of the Levant, even though we kind of focus on the Levant. We're going to go over to Egypt for a minute, but this is still a temple of the Israelite people. And it was an Israelite temple, but located in way southern Egypt in a town called Aswan. Records of this temple being in action, so to speak, it's around the time of the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. So contemporary to this Temple of Solomon. The temple may have been built as early as the 7th century BCE as a part of an Israelite mercenary garrison. Some scholars believe it might have been a few centuries later and built for different reasons, particularly by refugees or exiles after the destruction of Solomon's temple. It may have also been based on the tabernacle, which was a Hebrew or Israelite mobile temple that we'll get into. Either way, sacrifices were done at this temple throughout its active period. It was built as either a shrine for a people who couldn't get to their main temple in Jerusalem, or as a place of sacrifice instead of Solomon's temple, or as just an alternative sacrificial center. Now let's get back into the Levant with another temple, which was Tel Motza or Motza. And this is an Iron Age Judean temple located only 7 kilometers north of Jerusalem and Solomon's temple. It has very similar dimensions to 2 temples we'll discuss shortly, Tel Tayanat and Ein Dara, and is even connected textually to Solomon's temple. This Tel Motza was a full-blown cultic center tied to the Jerusalem temple. Possibly it was an agricultural industrial satellite temple, you might say, to Solomon's temple. And it must have been authorized in some way by the Judean kings and the religious authorities in Jerusalem, and couldn't, being that it was only about an hour's walk, 2 hours walk away from Jerusalem. It was destroyed around the same time as Solomon's temple. Interestingly, this temple was just recently discovered and major digs are going on. Now, does this temple question the idea of a monopoly of power in the Jerusalem-based temple in Judea, or does it affirm it? I think you could go either way with that one. And being that the scholars are still digging on this temple, we could speculate a little bit. I would think that probably in a way it bolsters the idea of a monopoly because of the Jerusalem temple and the Jerusalem-based sect, because it's so close. It's obvious to me, or it seems clear to me that you couldn't have something so close just operating on its own devices, that especially since it seems like the temple was specialized, it could have been involved in here, bring in the produce, do your sacrifices here so that you don't have to bring your produce that next couple hours of travel to Jerusalem. That's sort of a congregation center. And then maybe those sacrifices could be moved further on. I mean, there's a lot to discuss there, and hopefully as digs in these temples go forward, we'll get to learn more. Let's talk a little bit about what might be the true Israelite temple, the Mount Gerizim temple. Mount Gerizim is the sacred place of the Samaritan ethnic religious group. It's located about 50 kilometers due north of Jerusalem in the area of Samaria, or what you could call in the area of the pre-Babylonian exile, the ancient kingdom of Israel. Not much is known about the ancient history of this temple beyond the Persian period, but it must be much older. References to Moses saying that this temple should be built is in the Bible. Now, that could be that it's either an actual connection to the deep past or an attempt to connect it to the deep past. It makes sense to have a temple at Gerizim. The independent kingdom of Israel needed its own cultic center to tie together the king and the religion of this northern kingdom. You wouldn't want to give the monopoly of religion and religious power to the southern kingdom, independent kingdom of Jerusalem at their temple. Remember, temples are much more than religious places. They are places of power. I mean, we can even tie that into the Catholic religion. A lot of nation states had a huge problem with the religion of Roman Catholicism being tied to the Vatican here in the United States and countries all over the world. And they wanted France, in particular during the French Revolution and that revolutionary time, and even before with Gallicanism, as we saw in our previous series, there's definitely an issue there that you want your religious power and your secular governmental kingship power tied all in together. You don't want them separated, and you don't want to give that power to somebody else to hold and to have. That idea of the separation of religion and state just doesn't exist. It would be basically preposterous to them. If you want to look at it, the deity lives there in the temple, giving the people or the king a tremendous amount of power. Temples are big money, donations of coins, and different offerings would go there, and the priest and the king skim a little bit off of the top. An independent kingdom like Israel wasn't going to give up that power to another kingdom like Judea, no matter what the religious reasons. You can see why there was so much conflict described in the Old Testament books between the southern Judean kingdom and the Israelite kingdom in the north in the Bible. They were competing religious, military, and economic entities. Now let's talk a little bit about something called shrines. During and before the time of the Temple of Solomon, there's evidence of small shrines or altars called bama, or plural in Hebrew, bamat. There's both archaeological and biblical textual evidence for these shrines. They're based upon and related to general Canaanite models. They're usually built on artificial mounds in high elevated places like hilltops, but they're also mentioned being built in the bottom of valleys. They served as local places for local people to conduct a local religion, very localist. The Jerusalem-based Solomon Temple-based society likely either marked the end or the decline of these local shrines. There's still examples of local shrines and worship even into the Persian Second Temple period, but the monopoly of religious power was moving towards that centralized temple. That's where the kings and the royal court and the centers of power located. And there would have been a push and a pull between centralization and localization, but the tendency was towards the central temple. And in this case, for this series, Solomon's temple, but we'll get into this issue more. Now, there's a bunch of related and even very closely related temple ideas to what we think Solomon's temple looked like. Now, there's Canaanite temples in Lachish and Hazor. They're located in Jerusalem, they're located in Judea, very close to Jerusalem. They exhibited many of the same styles and functions of the Jerusalem temple. With Solomon's temple, we're talking about the southern Levant. But if we go up the coast a little bit, we can look at some temples in the northern Levant, in the area of Syria, that are very, very similar to Solomon's temple. The first one is the Tel Tayanet temple. It's two temples discovered in the far northern Levant, modern-day southern Turkey, northeastern Syria border area. There's Tayanet Temple 1, which is excavated in the 1930s, and then Tayanet Temple 2, excavated beginning in 2008. These temples are what archaeologists call the symmetrical Syrian temple design. They're very similar in layout to the description of Solomon's temple, and they're contemporary to Solomon's temple, built in the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. There's some interesting findings from Tayanet Temple 2. It has a clear Holy of the Holies area where they found ritualistic tools, libation bowls. They also found in the inner holy place cuneiform tablets. Now, they haven't been fully translated, but they could be treaties, covenant, and law table tablets, which matches the description from the Bible that the covenant between God and the Israels, the 10 Commandment tablets, were housed inside of the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. So very similar. In Tayanet, the important documents of the people were held in the Holy of Holies. Same thing with the Temple of Solomon with the 10 Commandments, the very basic covenant or law contract between the people and God. These temples show that they were renovated periodically. The Temple of Solomon also went through renovation cycles. One issue, though, is that these temples are really, really far from Judea. As the crow flies, over 300 miles or almost 500 kilometers away. That's as the crow flies. Tayanet and Solomon's temple were both in a Levantine Fertile Crescent context, even though they were quite far apart. So you can see that even though there's temple traditions that are closer, because these Canaanites had a really tight connection with this Fertile Crescent area, you could see why there might be more connection there. Let's talk a little bit about another temple called Ain Dara. This is possibly the closest analog found so far to Solomon's temple. It was located in a similar area geographically as the Tayanet temple complex. Ain Dara is across the border, though solidly in northern Syria. It was first discovered in the 1950s and excavated in the 1980s. Ain Dara existed at almost the exact same time as Solomon's temple. It's described as having an almost exactly identical layout to Solomon's temple. Same layout, same dimensions, same use of die-style columns in the entrance to the temple, representations of sphinxes similar to the representation of the cherubim in Solomon's temple. How do scholars determine then how exactly or identical they are? It's maybe a little bit different than how we might evaluate that as laymen, but based on the archaeology of the Ain Dara and description of the Temple of Solomon from the Book of Kings, scholars can come to certain qualifications, you might say. John Monson in the Biblical Archaeological Review magazine says 33 of 65 elements described in the Book of Kings are identical to Ain Dara. My question is 51% of elements being identical really identical? I was a little dubious at first thinking about that. 51% identical, is that really enough to say temples were in fact identical? I got to thinking about it a little bit, and I'm thinking 51%, if you looked at buildings that were 50% identical, you'd say they were pretty doggone close. And we're talking about the major elements of these two buildings are identical. So I think that could be an accurate statement, in at least my most humble amateur position. Now, what god was worshipped in these temples, Ain Dara and then the Tayanet complex? Nobody's sure. Could it be a storm god or possibly the female goddess Ishtar? Ishtar's kind of cool, and we could talk a little bit more about her later. We could also talk about maybe some Indo-European influences of sky father gods on the Canaanites and the Syrians. Also influences of sky fathers from the south, from the Arabian Peninsula. So here's some really interesting little facts about the Ain Dara temple. 3 over 1 meter long bare footprints were carved walking into the temple. Now, based on that stride, the feet would belong to someone over 65 feet or 20 meters tall. Now, that's a really cool, awesome representation. You don't even have to show the god. You're showing his feet. And that's maybe connecting to this god that can't be represented. You can't boil this giant god down to an icon. All you have to show is these footprints. Now, likely a 65-foot tall god would not have been able to physically stand up straight in that temple. He probably couldn't have even walked through the door of the temple, but god giants can do what they want. This is actually similar to the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, Greece, where the sitting statue of Zeus would not have been able to stand in the temple and would not have been able to get through the door. These gigantic footprints may have been related to passages in the book of Ezekiel related to radiant glory. Let me quote a little bit of that passage here.
Afterward, he brought me to the gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east. His voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. It was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when I came to destroy the city. The visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. And the glory of the Lord came into the temple by way of the gate which faces toward the east. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Then I heard him speaking to me from the temple, while a man stood beside me. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. But it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today. Ezekiel 43, 1-7. Here's my little interpretation. The temple or the iconography was purposefully designed to show that the deity could not be contained in the temple. I lean in the direction that this temple was dedicated in some way to a sky storm god similar to Yahweh. The footprints are sort of an aniconism. They're not showing that God exactly. They're showing a representation of that God. It's maybe metaphorical, one step forward or one step backward from a literal interpretation. The Israelites may have taken that aniconism to the next step where they didn't even show the footprints. You don't need footprints to know that the God couldn't be contained in one place. And we'll start to talk about this aniconism later. Sadly, in the crazy times of ISIS in the late 2010s, the Turkish government did an airstrike which destroyed much of the Ayn temple. The Turkish regime has been very rough on history and archaeology. I mean, they see turning former Byzantine churches from museums into mosques, and military strikes in Syria. Oftentimes ISIS gets the blame for, and then in Afghanistan, the Taliban get blamed for blowing up all of this archaeology. But the Turkish regime should not be given much slack as well. I won't harp on this all day, but I reserve the right to harp on antiquities being destroyed at a later time. Let's talk a little bit of influences on Judean and Israelite temples on their iconography and religion. Many, many temples were built in this Syrian style in the Fertile Crescent and the Levant, all the way down to Judea. And clearly we're including Solomon's temple in this list. Judea was very close to Egypt and was even under the Egyptian control from time to time, but there doesn't appear to be a huge influence on Israelite temple architecture from Egypt. This is odd to me, at least for a few reasons. Judea and Israel are so close to Egypt geographically. The Israelites, according to the Old Testament, were supposed to have been in Egypt for generations, but the Israelites didn't adopt many Egyptian art and iconography or architectural elements. The temple and its culture were completely analogous to other Canaanite, Levantine, and Syrian models. There are examples of Canaanite neighbors adopting some Egyptian elements into their temples because Egypt ruled parts of this area for many centuries. And we'll get more into that in the upcoming bonus episode on Ezekiel's temple. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. These are excerpts from 2 of the 10 commandments. And if we were to speculate, what are these to mean to us, these commandments, especially in the context of practical religion of the time? The 9th, 10th century antiquity was a city-state and a tribal society. Levantine people lived in a tribal society. They had a headman or a chieftain whom they were personally connected to. They had a god who they were personally connected to, just like their tribal leader. Their tribal was definitely their metaphorical father and could have literally been their father as well. Their god fulfilled the same spiritual and celestial role. You have your earthly father, your earthly chieftain, and then you have your heavenly father or chieftain. You can see this in the ancient texts, such as the Bible, the Mesha Stela, and many other sources, the Ugaritic texts. The God of the Old Testament said to put no other gods before him because there were other God options, especially for those who lived on the margin of the tribal structure. You live kind of outside of that. If your chieftain and your God isn't serving you quite well, you can slide over and become a part of another very similarly related tribe and chieftain. And there would have been a struggle for that loyalty. God was jealous, just like the tribal leader was jealous for honor and loyalty and power over and from his people. Look at the story of Jacob, who became Israel. He was a powerful chieftain. He had at least 13 kids of his own, born from at least 4 different moms. I bet you a guy like that would have had many other children. Each of Jacob's main kids had kids, forming the 12 tribes of Israel. Each of those tribes were all connected to each other through familial and marriage bonds. They were bound together by the power of their chieftain and the power of their God. There was an idea floating around at that time amongst the Canaanites, and I'm sure amongst the early Israelites, that there was a pantheon of gods, that there was a main sky god who had children. That sky god had a wife. It was a tighter pantheon than the Romans. Among the Israelites, the idea that the one God of theirs, Yahweh, was above the other ones, and then eventually that there were actually no other gods, became normative. But clearly in the Bible, this idea of monotheism or monolatry, as some scholars call it, was being tested constantly. The Romans and the Greeks had different ideas about their gods. Their gods were more remote, more elemental, not personal gods, even though in their stories the gods would interface with the humanity at times. It's not a personal connection that you have with Zeus or Jupiter or Athena. Ancestor worship was something, and ideas looking much more like animism were more of the deal for especially the Romans. The Romans were all in on ancestor worship. The Israelites certainly would have supported their ancestors and their ancestors who had died, but they weren't worshiping them in any way similar to the Romans. The idea of what people thought about their gods, basically their theology, dictated how they worshiped and where they worshiped in their temples. We're going to end this extended setup day. We got a lay of the land of where the temple came from. Now we get into the story of one of the gods that was in direct competition with the one God of Israel.
He opens a casement in the house, a window within the palace. Baal opens rifts in the clouds. Baal gives forth his holy voice. Baal discharges the utterances of his lips. His holy voice convulses the earth. The mountains quake.
Ancient Near Eastern texts relating to the Old Testament, edited by James B. Pritchard, 3rd edition, Princeton University Press. Today we're going to press on with another topic that is literally central to the understanding of the First Temple of Jerusalem period, also known as Solomon's Temple. What could this topic be? What is the absolutely most central point, literally and metaphorically, in any temple. The holy of the holies, so to speak. That topic is what God or gods were worshipped, honored, and celebrated in a temple or the temple. Our objective in this episode will be to sort out who was the God worshipped at Solomon's temple, and where did the idea, the ideology, you might say the theology of that God, where did it come from? This episode certainly won't and can't truly reach that objective, but we can at least get a good overview of the topic of the God of Solomon's temple and his context. We'll also get a chance to make some more speculations and ask some more questions. This episode is in a continuing series that is and was inspired by Rome level patron Peter the Great and others on the First Temple of Jerusalem. We have mostly focused on the Second Temple of Jerusalem in this entire podcast because that's the period that most directly and immediately shaped Christianity of the first century CE. But you can't have a second temple without a first, so it's worth spending a bit of time on in this era because it's fun, at least I think so, and we'll definitely get to build a little bit more of that context we need to understand the Second Temple. So now here's the easy part. We can say with great certainty who the God was who was worshipped at the Temple of Solomon. That is Yahweh. And I'm just going to use the typical American English pronunciation of that word Yahweh. Now, some people might find it a little, offensive to use Yahweh, being that it's the name of God. In the theology of the First Temple, they wouldn't have actually said his name. They would have used what we might call kennings to get around that. That's where we get Adonai and the Lord, instead of saying his actual name. Now, according to Gil Kedron, Yahweh is much more acceptable as a term at least in modern day Israel. It's not as shocking as what the ancient Israelites would have found. But that's his name. That's the name. So that's what we're going to go with. And also Yahweh is where we get the term Jehovah from, through a variety of sound changes from ancient Hebrew into ancient Greek into Latin. Now the meaning of the name Yahweh isn't exact and it isn't exactly clear. It can mean something like I am, or he who is, or he that is. The name can show, it's really meant to show totality and an incalculable greatness. I am. You're what? I am. Yahweh doesn't need an adjective or descriptor after the am part. He just is. The Israelites took a journey through several stages to get to Yahweh as the only game in town. They really started off, a lot of people will say that they were polytheistic, and that's really not 100% accurate. They really made a journey through henotheism to monolatry, ending up at monotheism. Some will say that the Israelites were always monotheists, or only believed that there was one God and that there was no other gods, period. There's God, and then anybody else, any other thing that people would call a god is not actually a god at all. And to the point even that any people worshiping something that isn't the one true God is not actually worshiping a god. They're maybe worshiping nothing at all, or they're maybe worshiping something that isn't divine, or something that is an uncreated being, like maybe a fallen angel or a demon or something to that effect. Some, as we said, some scholars and people will say that the ancient Israelites were just polytheists like everybody else in the Levant, or more or less the whole world at that time, except for a few rare exceptions. Hey, there were a lot of polytheists back then, and that there is no doubt whatsoever. The Egyptians were polytheists, But don't forget, they did play around with the idea of monotheism, or at least monolatry. The Old Testament text and other texts show that the ancient Israelites were at least somewhere between a henotheist people and monolatrists. But who cares? Polytheist, monotheist, henotheist, monolatrists. We see hints of each of these in the Israelites' own sacred texts, the Bible. Polytheism is the hardest to find, and I think personally that the Israelite religion doesn't really show signs of true polytheism, meaning the worship of many gods. In a situation where each of the gods more or less are on an equal footing, think of maybe the Roman and Greek paganism. People worship Zeus for certain things, Poseidon for others. Zeus was higher up in the hierarchy, but that didn't degrade in any way the divinity of Athena. Also, the actual worship of ancestors and raising people into godlike levels, like the emperor was a god king of a sort. The Israelites may have had these tendencies in the deep past, but not in a way that significantly shows up in their sacred literature. Henotheism, or the belief that other gods existed, but there is one high God that's to be worshipped above all others, is definitely a characteristic that can be found in many ways in the Israelite religion. Now, monolatry is the next step into that, and it's a key step in the movement for the Israelite religion. The belief that other gods exist, but only one God should be worshipped. And we see this clearly in the book of Exodus for sure. Moses and some of his company are mad with the capital M that the people made the golden calf. The calf likely represented either an Egyptian god or Baal. Moses is up on that mountain literally trying to hammer out a deal, a covenant with God Most High, and the people are down there worshiping other gods. Moses doesn't want any part of that. And if we look at Exodus 20-3, the commandment of thou shalt not have any gods before me, that's really a monolatrous statement. On the other hand, you could say that the rest of the Israelites and Moses' own brother, Aaron, are being henotheists. At least you could charitably say they were honoring the one God, but hedging their bets by making the golden calf. Strict monotheism is something that we will see hints of in the First Temple period, but it's really something that explodes out of the Babylonian exile. The Israelite religion of the First Temple has to be viewed through a different lens than the post-exile Babylonian exile Judaism. Post-Babylonian exile Judaism is another very complicated matter that we've touched upon a lot in this entire podcast, History of the Papacy. But this is the time where most scholars think that the Israelite religion becomes fully monotheist. Not Yahweh is the highest God of them all or the preferred God. He is God. And that's it. And we can certainly see that the God that was worshipped by the Israelites in Solomon's temple was Yahweh. But who was Yahweh? He's literally I am, or he that is. Yahweh is connected to the greater Canaanite Phoenician pantheon of deities. This is a generally accepted theory, but other scholars say the connection is very weak and that there was no textual evidence to make this connection. That is the biggest difficulty of sorting all of this out. As far as topics go, this is the deepest end of the deep end of the pool of topics, not just in religion, but really the topics of any topic. Scholars have studied and debated every single aspect of Yahweh for so long, for thousands of years, essentially. We're barely dipping our toe into the pool here. But if you're interested, reach out and I can point you in at least a few directions where you can delve into your own rabbit hole. What is interesting is the scholars don't have a ton of evidence for the deep, deep past of Yahweh. The oldest direct textual evidence, or archaeological evidence for that matter, is from something called the Meshi Stela, not the Messi Stela, the Meshi Stela. This is a stone block from the area of Moab, home of the Moabites. The Moabites lived in the area just east of the Israelites to the southeast in modern-day Jordan. The Moabites were a related South Canaanite people and were pretty much in constant conflict with the Israelites. I would imagine it of a situation of competing tribes, border raiding, that sort of thing. They couldn't get along with each other, so they were in conflict with each other. Now, the Moabites were more connected in with the culture of the south and into the Arabian Peninsula, whereas Israel, for the most part, had closer connections to the northern and western Semitic groups of the Levant and the northern eastern Mediterranean coast. And what the Meshi Stela recounts is the Moabite defeat of Israel. The Stela states that the ritualistic items of Yahweh were looted and then taken back to Moab as the spoils of war. And you get this whole gist of the Meshi Stela of one tribe fighting another tribe. And look at our tribal god beat up your tribal god. And it would have been the same thing on the battlefield. Our tribal king or tribal chieftain beats up on your tribal chieftain. It's very, and I'm not trying to sell them out or sell them lowly by saying they were tribes. Tribe is a very tight organization. It's family. It's not a lot of different groups of people mashed together. It's a very homogeneous group, and you can have a certain organizational structure when you are such a tight group. Now, there are other inscriptions that say or mention Yahweh from other places, including southern Egypt of all places. These inscriptions could be referring to Yahweh in different ways and not necessarily Yahweh as the God of Israel, sort of Yahweh, different versions from different pantheons or different aspects, perspectives of Yahweh. The other source of information on Yahweh is textual evidence. There are texts from the city of Ugarit up in the northern Levant, sort of the modern day extreme southern Turkey, Syria. It's actually in Syria, but it's where Turkey and Syria meet up together. Then, of course, the biggest text of them all that we all have today is the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, or whatever you prefer to call that Israelite sacred text. A lot of people get just right bent out of shape using the Bible as a historical source. I had an email exchange with a listener who reached out with the question of using the Bible, either the New or Old Testament, as a historical source. Now, he wasn't bent out of shape, not in any way, shape, or form. And we had a really fun and I think informative email exchange. His question was basically, how much can the Bible be trusted as a source when there's so many clear ahistorical and or historical accuracies in the text, events and people, places that have been shown not to have happened or happened in a quite different way based on other more objective evidence are in conflict with what was written in the Bible. My view on the Bible is that it isn't meant to be a literal history or fact book. It's clearly an anthology written at vastly different times, different places, and different genres by different people. There is biography, poetry, song, metaphor, theology. Different parts of the Bible are some of the oldest writings in human history, and other parts of the Old Testament were written pretty darn close to the dawn of the Common Era. The documents of the Old Testament were also related and edited over the years by people with different agendas, different perspectives, and different purposes than the original authors. So for me, in my opinion, the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, should be treated like any other text in a historical investigation. People shouldn't take the text purely at face value, but try to understand who wrote the text, when it was written, who it was written for, and how did the people who wrote the text understand themselves and how that was represented in the text. It's a text for a certain people at a certain time. And I personally don't think that's in any conflict if you believe that it was an inspired document, inspired by the Holy Spirit or God. I think you can still see that it sits in a certain place at a certain time in a certain context. And it should be understood that way as a human document, a document for a people by a people. People should use it as how does the text line up and diverge with other texts, as well as physical archaeological evidence. I'm no historian. My degrees aren't in history, so I don't have any formal training in historical investigation methodologies. But really, how else could one conduct an investigation or a line of inquiry? You have to gather your sources, evaluate them in as many ways as you possibly can, and with as many tools as you have at your disposal. To write off a piece of evidence just because you don't like it, or you're biased against it, or because you don't like the people or the way they use that text today doesn't seem like a great way to me, or at the very least an unbiased way to study a topic. But hey, what do I know? I'm not a professional historian. Maybe they teach some sort of magic sauce in a different way on how to conduct an investigation, a line of inquiry, but maybe I'm looking at it in the wrong way. But let's get back to the textual evidence for Yahweh. Besides the Bible, we have those other sources. And one of the most important sources, as we said, is that those Ugaritic texts discovered in the early part of the 20th century. They were discovered in the ancient ruined city of Ugarit. Ugarit is on the northern part of the Mediterranean coast of Syria. If you look at a map, the unicorn-looking part of the island of Cyprus points directly at where Ugarit was. If you follow it across the sea, and where that line would make landfall. The texts that were discovered in Ugarit were a treasure trove for historians, archaeologists, linguistics, biblical scholars, you name it. One of the Ugaritic texts, the one that the opening quote comes from, is called the Baal Cycle. The Baal Cycle gives a clear view on the mythology that was the basis for the belief system of the northwestern Semitic Phoenicians and Canaanite people. There was a ton of local variation on these themes, but the base story and the characters can be found in the Baal Cycle as discovered in Ugarit. The short story of the Baal Cycle is that Baal was a thunder sky god. The father of the gods was a guy named El, and El wants to cut back and release some of his responsibilities to a new god. Essentially, El wants to go into semi-retirement. El is the picture of the grandfatherly, wise God. He's merciful. He's wise. El means Lord or God, but it's also the generic Semitic term just in all of these Semitic languages for God. El. Yam, or Yam, I would probably more likely, is the god of the sea, and he is the heir apparent to El. But there's another god he's a much better fit than Yam, and his name is Baal. Baal and Yam have all types of battles and intrigues, and it pulls in all the other gods in there. Baal has to go to the underworld, but he comes back and he defeats Yam with his mighty club. Now, I just might be imagining this, but this whole story sounds a lot like the story of Heracles or Hercules, and really the base mythology of almost all Indo-European groups. That gets me thinking of many different possibilities and speculations. It could just be pure coincidence. It could also be that these ancient stories of sea gods and storm gods could have been influenced by the earliest Indo-Europeans. The area of Ugarit was flanked on two sides by early Indo-European groups. To the west was the Hittites, and to the east was the Mitanni. The religion of the Hittites was super complicated because they took in bits and pieces from everyone. But scholars think that there was a core of ancient European mythology in there with the Hittites. The Mitanni are even more obscure, but they likely would have had an even more direct connection to the Indo-European mythological tradition. But back to Baal. Baal winds up on the top of the Canaanite god pantheon heap. Yahweh gets very complicated because some scholars say that he was a minor god in the Canaanite pantheon and kind of played in with this Baal cycle. Others say that he was an influence of storm and war gods from the south, such as from the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. One theory is that Yahweh wasn't a storm god, or at least he wasn't a traditional war storm god. He was a god of metallurgy and creation. And there's archaeology, particularly from Egypt and from Canaan, that supports this idea. There's temples near mines in Egypt in the Levant that had Yahweh cultic influence. What some scholars think is that Yahweh and El merged together into one God. And that's why we get Yahweh and El mentioned in the Bible, Elohim, or attributes of one of these gods was put onto or assimilated to another one. And this could explain a lot of how the God of the Israelites is really quite unique amongst deities. El/Yahweh was all powerful, a creator, a father, a king, but also merciful. He was responsible for his people and wanted the best for them. He was connected to his people in a way that other gods were not. And this might explain why Baal was such a baddie in the Bible. Baal went through a similar growth process as Yahweh. They were both upstarts, movers and shakers in the Canaanite pantheon. Baal and Yahweh were fighting over similar turf, you might say. They were both supreme gods associated with the elemental forces of the sky, storms, etc. They came to those attributes from slightly different directions, though. The Temple of Solomon's location in Jerusalem is key. According to the Bible and archaeology, there were individual tribes of Israelites that lived throughout the central to southern part of Levant. They eventually coalesced into a united kingdom of Israel, according to the Bible, but not 100% backed up to other sources. The United Kingdom had 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, hence the Temple of Solomon. We'll get into what existed before Solomon in an upcoming episode. After Solomon, and just the short story of that is, during the time of David and Saul, religious practices would have been done in other locations, particularly the mobile tent temple, the tabernacle. But we'll get into that in the next episode. After Solomon, the United Kingdom separated into 2 parts. The kingdom of Israel to the north, which is more or less in the area of Samaria, and then the kingdom of Judah to the south. Both of the kingdoms were fairly powerful and prosperous. Both Israel and Judah shared a common Israelite religion, but it was a diverse henotheistic, borderline monolatrist religion based around the Yahweh cult. The northern kingdom of Israel was connected into the rich and powerful Phoenician trade system to the north in what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians worshipped a version of Baal, among others. Baal worship of the Phoenicians definitely rubbed off on the northern kingdom of Israel, Israelite religion. And we see this all over the Old Testament document. The northern kingdom of Israel was always falling into Baal worship. See the Jezebel story. Just look at the names of the people involved in the Jezebel story, Jezebel and Elijah. Jezebel has a name that includes a Baal component, and Elijah's name has the Yahweh component. See, Elijah would have been pronounced something that more represented the Yah component. But for the most part, the Old Testament was a Judahite southern kingdom project. And you can always go straight to the cynical. The Old Testament depiction of the northern kingdom of Israel is driven by the political bias of the southern Judahite writers and redactors. But it could be they were accurately depicting a serious difference of opinion or outlook with their northern neighbors and kinsmen. The two kingdoms were so similar in so many ways, but the differences can lead to huge conflict, especially with those two conflicts that were conflicted over resources, trade, and the dominance of the religion. Who's the leader of this Israelite religion? The kingdom, the king of Judah or the king of Israel? The final piece of the puzzle to put into place with who was worshipped at the temple is how did the Israelites become a group that evolved away from depicting their God in art and images. The Israelite religion became uniquely aniconic. There is another really tricky and complicated area of discussion that we're just going to slightly wade into. Depending on your perspective, you will start with very different ideas. Generally speaking, both modern-day Jews and Christians, along with Muslims, would say you cannot depict God in images. Images are made even more complicated in Christianity. Some Christians are very much against sacred art and depictions altogether. Most Christian groups, now I say most because there are groups that don't follow this, but most Roman Catholics, Orthodox, and others would say that Jesus, as the second person of the Trinity, can be depicted in art, but that God the Father, the first person of the Trinity, cannot be depicted. Now, the third person, the Holy Spirit, can also be depicted as well. The Holy Spirit is depicted as a dove. Aniconism is something that slowly came into the Israelite religion. Aniconism is related to the fact that God can't be depicted because if you saw God, you would just burn up. He is too great and all-encompassing to observe, let alone describe in word and art. It's trying to describe the universe, the elemental forces, everything in a picture or a couple of words. You can't get everything in there. It's not humanly possible. The archaeology shows that the Israelites and the Judahites did depict their God in art in some cases. There are figurines, particularly of a large standing stone called Masaboth and other depictions. Again, like with all of this with Yahweh and the religion of the first temple, there's a lot of controversy and disagreement between different scholars and religions on what all these depictions mean. There will be parts of the Bible where some will say something happened and was done by angels, but others will say that the scene was a theophany or an event where God himself was a part of the action. One example of this from the pre-First Temple period is the hospitality of Abraham in Genesis. The destruction of the First Temple and the subsequent Babylonian exile likely kicked this aniconism to the next level. That's another long story and an interesting story, but a story for a different time and a different day. We've seen in a very short and simplified way how Yahweh developed from a God of many gods to one God and only one God. You can't have a temple without a God, and we can see the rough outline of the God of the Israelites. Before we move on to the mobile tent of meeting, we should take a look at another temple complex in the neighborhood of Solomon's temple and the role that it played. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. This episode will rely primarily on the Biblical Archaeology Review magazine called House of the Rising Sun, Azeka's Canaanite Temple by Lipschitz, Rips, Oming, and Hyman. I've included some other material from other sources, but this Biblical Archaeology Review article is in their magazine is all over this temple and covering this temple. What was the time and the place of Azeka's temple? The temple is located in Shepla in the Judean foothills on top of the Elah Valley. The place is essentially central Judea on the border between the hill country leading up to Jerusalem and the coastal plain leading down to the Mediterranean Sea. So to put that into perspective, it's about 36 kilometers from Ashdod on the Mediterranean Sea, walking downhill from 200 meters to sea level. Doable, very doable and a one-day journey, and about the same distance to Ashkelon. Now it was a 43-kilometer walk to Jerusalem, walking uphill about 500 meters, and this would have been up and down through the hill country. So I would say it was at the very least a 2-day journey and not an easy trip to Jerusalem. And location matters. For a time from the mid-16th century BC to the 12th century, the southern Levant and Canaan, including this area around the temple, were ruled by Egypt. This is the late Bronze Age era. This area of Shephelah would be pretty easily connected back to Egypt. It might have taken as little as a few days to get from the Azekah temple to Egypt. This relative closeness connected this temple complex closely to the Egyptian administration, both economically and culturally. Now let's talk about the actual location of the temple. It overlooked a valley pointed in the direction of the rising sun. Temples pointing to the east is a very old concept, clearly because this temple is very old. Churches to this day are specifically designed to point to the east. The eastward orientation is a concept that spread far and wide in ancient temple design. We talked about the place, now let's talk about the time. The temple was started around the 13th century BC. This was during the time of the New Kingdom of Egypt, which controlled the southern Levant, including Canaan. The Azekah temple started as an open structure, but through a series of renovations was enclosed in a building in the 12th century, which was at the high point of its importance. It also happens that in that same century, the temple was destroyed. The rise and the fall of this temple. The rise in importance of this temple and its collapse and destruction track with the rise and fall of the great empire of the New Kingdom of Egypt. So let's just quickly talk about the New Kingdom of Egypt. This is really peak Egypt, you could say. Some of the top pharaohs that you've heard of, such as Ramesses II, lived during this time. The word pharaoh itself even starts in the New Kingdom. Pharaoh, which is a Greek word based on an Egyptian word, would come into prominence during this time. The term pharaoh would not have been used in Egypt prior to the New Kingdom period. The time period, during this time period, Egypt controlled the Levant, was a really what you could call a high time in human history. There was vast wealth and civilizations far and wide and trade connections to civilizations all over this Eastern Mediterranean area, and the trade networks would even go as far as Britain and into Afghanistan. Goods moved all across the ancient world, and this temple of Azekah was smack dab in the middle. It was the crossroads of several major trade routes. Azekah's temple was tied directly into the Egyptian administration, and it was the location of high-status good productions. Pottery, oils, and perfumes were made in the surrounding city for trade. Then something disastrous happened, and that is the Bronze Age collapse. In and around the year 1177, the entire world economy collapsed. And there's many theories for why this collapse happened, but the Bronze Age collapse did in fact happen, and it happened conveniently around the time of the end of Azekah's temple. Scholars try to say that the collapse happened because of one thing or another, the sea peoples, a volcano, or this or that. I think when you look at civilizational and economic collapse, it's generally that there's a lot of problems in the system. And you can see that in the famous 1177, the Bronze Age collapse book. Read other books as well. It's generally that the system has a lot of problems built into it. None of those problems, and even all of those problems in their totality, can collapse the system. But then something called a black swan event happens, and that makes all these fragilities in the system completely bottom out. There's tons of great books you can read on societal collapse and black swan events. In particular, one is called the Black Swan. But moving on from that, in the 12th century, the temple was destroyed. Archaeologists had discovered skeletons of 5 men in the ruins, or in the ruins, you could say, of the temple from ages 15 to 55. 2 were found in the courtyard area, and 3 others were probably on the roof as it fell in. So who were these guys? Were they priests holding out during the siege of the temple? Were they the defenders of the temple? Who was besieging the town? Was it the sea people? Proto-Israelites? Who knows? More archaeology will certainly shed light onto this situation, but you can see in the texts, in the ancient cuneiform texts, in the biblical texts, you can see remnants of this, that this was a cultural memory that was hanging out. I mean, honestly, it was a cultural memory in all of these areas that had been destroyed. We'll move on to the layout of the temple. The temple was originally completely open, basically just a roof. This wasn't that uncommon. But major renovations happened right before the destruction. They enclosed the sanctuary area. It had Egyptian influences on how the sacred area was laid out in items that were found there. So some of the finds were 7 lampstands or 7 bowls. That was of a common motif. An amulet with hieroglyphics, ceramic pottery featuring Egyptian gods, and the other Egyptian liturgical vessels. Also found was a small bronze figurine, which may have been a representation of the god Baal. Let's talk a little bit about Baal. And I mean, we could talk a lot about Baal, but here is a short discussion. He was a Canaanite Phoenician god, often set up as the baddie in the Old Testament, likely because Baal was a storm god and one of the many Canaanite gods who were in conflict with the Israelites, who worshipped a different storm god. And it's possible there's different texts that have been found. One called the Baal cycle. It could have been that the Israelites were worshiping Baal's son, Yahweh. There's so much more we could discuss about that, and we very well may in future episodes. Baal replaced El as the king of the gods, and El is one of the many names of the Israelite God, including Yahweh and Adonai. Much of the Baal-Yahweh conflict in the Bible may have come from the southern kingdom of Judah having conflict with the northern kingdom of Israel. Their religions may have been evolving in slightly different directions or paralleling each other, but having just some slightly different things going on. Think about the proximity of the kingdom of Israel to Phoenicia. Baal, also known as Bel, is pretty close to El, right? I mean, you can see a Baal, Bel, El, very similar. And there was in that day and age, a lot of opportunities for synchronization, differentiation, and divergence, and even convergence of belief. And not all of these things happening separately, all of them happening in different ways at different times in different aspects of the divergence, differentiation, synchronization, and convergence. We'll possibly get more into Baal in other episodes. I also have a wild theory that I think that there was some influence of Hittite Indo-European sky religion, and even coming from other groups, Indo-European groups such as the Mitanni, into this area, but that's a whole different story again for a different day. But getting back to the Azekah temple, this temple is important because it sheds light on a very early time in southern Canaanite history. This is the time before the kingdoms of unified Israel was even a thing, let alone a kingdom of Judah. It opens up a lot of speculations about how people moved around this area and could even shed light on the Exodus and other descriptions from the Old Testament. I think it makes us ask questions about why the Temple of Solomon has much more connection to the temple architecture traditions to Syria in the north and Semitic traditions than to temple traditions of Egypt. Egypt had such strong connections to this area of Canaan and influenced Canaanite temples, but later temples, such as Solomon's temple, don't share those influences. There's so much more to think about at this particular time period and geographical area. What makes it a great time period to think about is that so much was lost due to the Bronze Age collapse. The Bronze Age collapse is the thing that kind of overshadows all of this.
Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, that they bring me an offering. From everyone who gives it willingly with his heart, you shall take my offering. And this is the offering which you shall take from them: gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet thread, fine linen, and goat's hair, ram skins dyed red, badger skins, and acacia wood, oil for the light, and spices for the anointing oil, and for the sweet incense, onyx stones, and stones to be set in the ephod and in the breastplate. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show you, that is, the pattern of the tabernacle, and the pattern of all its furnishings, just so you shall make it."
Exodus 25, verses 1 through 9. This passage represents past of the people and their present. It represents the move of being a semi-nomadic pastoralist people to a great ancient kingdom. Our goal today will be to see what the tabernacle was, why it was so important for the early Israelites, and try and see what its place was in the creation of the Israelite to Jewish identity. That's a tall order, so let's get into it. The tabernacle, or in Hebrew, the Mishkan, was the dwelling place of God while the Israelites were on the move from Egypt in the early days of their settlements of the land of Canaan, at least according to the Bible. The tabernacle, at its most basic description, was a mobile tent temple, but it was no simple tent. This was the glamping of biblical proportions. When we think about the book of Exodus from the Old Testament, we think of the story of Moses coming up from a child in Egypt, connecting back to his Hebrew roots in the desert, freeing the 12 tribes of Israel from their 400-ish years of bondage, then taking them on an epic 40-year trip through the desert to get to the land promised to them by their God. The trip is complete with forming an agreement with God and receiving their mission statement through the 10 Commandments. Those events take about a little bit over the first half of the book of Exodus. The rest of the book is all about the tabernacle and establishing the processes and procedures for how to be an Israelite. So you see a major reformation of a religion that's kind of loosey-goosey, you might say, before Exodus, in the Genesis time period, where you don't really get a real read on what the religion is. And it's kind of confused in a way with what was up with what Abraham was doing. We see things with, say, Abraham, just for example, that aren't kosher. They're literally not kosher. He's cooking a kid with its milk. Like, it's in the Bible that he did that. So we're seeing a major change in their religion here. And what does that exactly mean? Every single detail you could possibly think of on how to construct a structure, in this case, a temporary movable structure, is detailed in the last 15 or so chapters of the 40-chapter book of Exodus. In the rest of the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also known as the Torah, we get more of the story of Moses and the tabernacle. We get tabernacle talk in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The tabernacle is the direct predecessor and model for the Temple of Solomon, but also took on a significant theological and metaphorical importance in the early Israelite religion, Second Temple Judaism, Rabbinical Judaism, and, of course, Christianity. So why a tent is a good question. Just the name tabernacle itself complicates things. English translations of the Bible always have what you might call a mystical factor. Certain words are left untranslated from the source language, and because people don't realize the words represent a simple term, the words take on an almost magical connotation. Some examples of that are a psalm, which a psalm in Greek just means a piece of music played by a plucked instrument or a stringed instrument. Exodus just means leaving on a road or hitting the road, you might say. Wouldn't that be different if the Bible in English translations called Exodus hitting the road? Genesis just means beginning. And there's so many words that are fairly simple, straightforward terms in their original language. They don't get translated, and then they take on that mystical meaning in English because they're not an everyday word that we use. So tabernacle is another. Tabernacle is a word that means tent, and that's all. So the tabernacle with an uppercase T is the tent of meeting. And this is where we get into the push and pull of scholarly debate. So one question is how to approach the Old Testament stories, and particularly the Exodus from Egypt. Should the Bible be taken at face value as reporting of actual events? Is the account of Exodus a metaphor or an allegory written or redacted much later to fit the narrative required of that later time? So in that spectrum of a reliable depiction of a historical event to pure fiction that was needed for certain post-dated political requirements is really the debate over the entire Bible from Old to New Testament. The other questions for exploration are what cultures did ancient Israel most interact with and were influenced by? The Egyptians, the Babylonians, or the Northwest Semitic groups? We have to ask ourselves all of those questions and much more when we're looking at these stories from the Bible. Another thing to consider is there, and what would the historical kernel be in these stories, and then what is added on to them? Lots of questions. So the big problem with trying to study a tent by its nature is a tent is not permanent. That makes archaeology very difficult to nigh on impossible. Now, there could be some indirect evidence for a tent, sacred spaces, but we don't have any direct evidence of the Israelite tabernacle. That means that texts have to be the primary source of evidence. According to the book of Exodus, the Hebrews or Israelites were a people on the move. Despite being in bondage in Egypt for 400 odd years since the time of Joseph, when he welcomed his dad, Israel, and his brothers, the sons of Israel, into Egypt to escape great famine. Genesis ends with everyone living happily ever after. Cut. Next page. Exodus begins with the sons of Israel struck low in slavery. Just the worst you could imagine. So that's a jarring cut in the Bible, jarring editing. No real transition, you might say, from awesome to really bad. I won't rehash the whole story of Exodus. Most people know it in broad strokes, and in the broad strokes, that's really enough. But recall that Moses was forced to leave Egypt. He crossed the Sinai wilderness, across the Red Sea, in no particular order, and then ended up in Midian. In Midian, Moses worked his way into the Midianite culture. He started to work for a local leader named either Reuel or Jethro and married his daughter Zipporah. Midian is important and intriguing for a few reasons. Midian is in the northeastern section of the Arabian Peninsula, at least two lands, you might say, south of the land of the Israelites proper. You have Moab and then Edom in between, and some other territories along the way. So you've got to go through at least two different people to go from the southern Israelites to get to the Midianites. So that raises some questions in your mind. The people of Midian are sons of Abraham, but they aren't Israelites. They aren't sons of Ishmael either. They are a related people to the Israelites, but their own things. They are clearly nomadic pastoralists, and for 40 years, Moses lived his best life in Midian until he encountered God Most High on his holy mountain, but not in the land of Israel or Canaan. God told Moses he had to set his people free from the situation in Israel. It's also really interesting that just take the two names that we mentioned of Midianites, Reuel and Zipporah. We get both of those deistic name endings, the El in Reuel, which means God. And then you also get the Yah ending in Zipporah. So was that actually their names or a translation from Midianite language into Israelite? That again raises a lot of questions of this common religion idea that was floating around in the Levant, from all the way the bottom of Levant, which you could even say that Midian was not in the Levant, all the way up through into Syria, northern Syria, southern Turkey. So going back to Moses, cutscene, after Moses arranged for the freedom of the Israelites, they had to book it out of Egypt. He went from the mountain to Egypt. We get the stories. So we have at least 3 layers of people on the move. Traditionally, the Israelites, when they were in Canaan, were a semi-nomadic pastoralist people. We can see that in the story of Joseph. They were moving their camp all around the land of Canaan to follow their flocks. It's all about flocks. We also get some agrarian discussion in there with the sheaves of wheat and stuff like that, but it shows a very specific section of time where they're definitely leaning more towards semi-pastoralists, where they have to move their flocks, but probably from a base camp where they did do a certain amount of agriculture. That's a definite Bronze Age kind of situation. Moses adopts a semi-nomadic pastoralist lifestyle through the Midianites. Once they're free, these now bondageless, unbonded Israelites who are free from Egypt, they don't have a home. They have to get out of Dodge, so to speak, and get to the promised land. Oh, wait, that 300-kilometer trip is going to take 40 years. The Israelites are on the move, a life on the move. This is where the tabernacle comes into the story. The Israelites have a 40-year trip of them. Is the 40 years in the desert literal? We have to ask ourselves. Were they actually wandering through the desert for 40 years on a trip that should have generously taken a few weeks to maybe a few months? We have to take into account if you were just a single person and you needed to get from, let's say, central Egypt to, let's say, just say Jerusalem, you could do that in a couple of days to a week. It would take some travel down the Nile. That would take some time. The shortest part of the trip would actually be getting from the Egyptian coast to the Judean coast on a boat. That wouldn't take very long. And then probably the longest part of your trip would be actually be traveling over land from the coast to Jerusalem, because you have to go down into some valleys and then up into hilly country. a week. Now, if you're moving an entire people on a mass leaving out, a mass hitting of the road in an exodus, that's going to take a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months to get all that organized and get those people. It's still not that big of a trip. So that leads us to really think about, is the 40 years metaphorical? The Israelites have to go through a purgation of sorts in order to settle the land that God has promised them. They also have to establish the norms and institutions of a people before they can settle. That's laid out for us. This 40 years could very well represent a cultural memory of a people transitioning from semi-nomadic pastoralism to a sedentary agriculturalist society. Think about Israel and his kids, pretty much pastoralists with some agriculture, into a society that's really focused on agriculture after that. It's even possible that the Exodus story is a redacted re-imaging of the Israelites' return to the southern Levant after the Babylonian exile. We discussed that with Gil Kedron of the podcast of Biblical Proportions, and that sure sounds reasonable to me. While in the desert, God gives Moses the plans for a temple, a mobile temple, where he can be worshipped. The Israelites are nomadic at this time, so they can't build a fixed temple. They are ordered or directed, you might say, or told to build a very specific structure. And God gives them the plans on how to build the mobile tent of meeting and instructions on how to worship there. And this is no Coleman tent. The tabernacle would be a lavish tent fit for the greatest of any Midianite sheikh or chieftain. So was the idea of the tabernacle tent of meeting inspired by the often extremely elaborate tents of desert nomads? In the archaeological record, we also see contemporary, elaborate, extremely well-designed and crafted Egyptian tents that were fashioned to be very easily disassembled and moved. Probably, honestly, easier than your Coleman tent with those sticks that never fold together correctly and then they break. These Egyptian tents were basically mortised and jointed in a way so that you just pop them apart and they could be very easily taken down and then put back together. So who are the influences and the influencers for all of this? This is the issue that I've struggled with. I spend way too much time thinking about this topic and what was the main influence on these early Israelites. There were so many opinions on where they came from, how they developed and evolved into the religion, culture, and language that we know of through the Bible. Israel, the land of Samaria and Judah, and the southern Levant in antiquity was more than just a crossroads. It was definitely a crossroads, but it's like an uber crossroads, a crossroads of the world. So many civilizations connected and clashed through this area, diverse cultures and civilizations on top of that. You have Egyptian civilization to the southeast, Arabian cultures to the southwest. These cultures connected deep into the Arabian Peninsula to points as far away as India and even China. You have the northwestern Semitic cultures to the northwest, Indo-European and European farmer cultures to the north and to the west, then the great civilizations of Babylon and Persia to the east, completely surrounded by great cultures. I think you can see how when you start to think that one culture was the main influence for one aspect of the Israelite culture, you can see how another culture may have been that influence as well. Then you have the internal culture of Israel itself. Israel was a unique people, and in and of itself have developed really unique ideas of their own. We are dealing with the culture with a strong sense of self, surrounded by highly influential cultures and civilizations. The Israelites were getting influenced, and they were influencers as well. So this gets really complicated, not just for us, but for the scholars as well. Now we get to the next step, the promised land. The tabernacle was the Israelites' place of worship wherever they traveled during their 40 years in the desert. After the narrative portion of Exodus, the Israelite people moved into the land of Canaan. Next stop, the promised land. The tabernacle was the Israelites' place of worship whenever they traveled during the 40 years in the desert. After the narrative in Exodus, the Israelite people moved into the land of Canaan. Presumably, the Israelites were coming home, right? The biblical source for most of this narrative is the book of Joshua. 400 years is a long time to be out of the picture, so the Israelites would have to fight it out with the established Canaanite kingdoms. A way to kind of think about that is, if somebody, a Native American group, migrated or was in some way taken out of the land, their land somewhere in North America, in the early 1600s, maybe a whole tribe was relocated and taken into bondage, and they were kept as they were able to keep their tribal identity when they were taken back to Spain or England or whatever. Then in 2024, 2025 or whatever, they come back to North America. They're going to see a very, very different situation than what they left in 1600. It's going to be unrecognizable to them. And if they're a warrior population, they've got to hit the scene, and they've got to be ready to start fighting to get their land back, because people are going to say, like, who are you? What are you doing here? Oh, you have some claim to the land because supposedly you were here 400 years ago. Where is it? Where did you live? I lived here. My people have been living here for 400 years. Whatever. You can see whatever you think about their right to that land, or the claims that they would have to that land, or how unfair it was of what that group did to them. Nobody's going to necessarily just lay down and give them that land back without a fight. That's the situation the Israelites found themselves in, at least according to the book of Joshua. Eventually, the Israelites established themselves in the land of Canaan and made a permanent encampment in the town of Shiloh. Probably Shiloh, more likely, but we'll go with Shiloh. That is where the tabernacle was set up on a permanent basis. The Israelites got into a number of scrapes with the neighboring Philistines. In a famous battle in the Bible, the Israelites brought forth the Ark of the Covenant. Don't worry about the Ark of the Covenant. We'll get into that in just a moment, to win an important victory. That doesn't work out, and the Philistines took the ark. Later on, the Philistines marched into Shiloh and wrecked the place. The tabernacle is said to have been destroyed at that point. Others say that the tabernacle was replaced essentially with the Tabernacle 2.0. Scholars back in the 1800s tried to find the location of where the tabernacle was in the place that they thought they identified in Shiloh. So you want to talk about speculations and conjectures and what ifs. Read about the scholars trying to interpret a hillside that was prepped to be a permanent place for the tabernacle. This is based on an interpretation of the dimensions from the Bible, in which the units of measure have to be interpreted, and then later observations made by people who supposedly saw the tabernacle on site, and then their interpretations need to be interpreted. We're talking about speculations piled on top of speculations piled on top of interpretation. We could write off all these speculations if they were done by Indiana Jones style archaeologists of the 1800s who just wanted to prove everything in the Bible and then maybe get some gold as a side benefit. But modern scholars do this as well, and they make careers out of building these speculations and then fighting other scholars over all of their speculations. I think it's safe to say there is likely nothing left of the tabernacle, and finding the precise site of where the tabernacle stood would be very difficult to determine with any exactness. Looking for tent posts. How do you know they're tent posts? Maybe they're in a rectangular formation, but maybe it's just a tent. Who knows? Maybe it was rectangular because it was a pasture that was marked off with fencing. I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm sure I know the archaeologists have a lot more ideas to build their speculations upon. But boy, that is, to me, as an outsider looking in, that is pure speculation built on very shaky ground. One way or the other, the tabernacle just doesn't exist or survive in any way, shape, or form to this day that we know of. Be that as it may, we have highly detailed descriptions of what the tabernacle looked like and what it contained. The tabernacle was laid out in how we would expect an ancient temple to be designed: an outer courtyard, an inner courtyard, a sanctuary, or a holy place. And then the Holy of the Holies held something called the Ark of the Covenant, or a place where legal tablets would have been held. So we talked about the Ark. Let's take a quick little detour and talk about the Ark of the Covenant. Ark is a word that's used quite frequently in the Bible. Noah's Ark, the crib that was floated down the Nile holding the baby Moses, was called an ark, the Ark of the Covenant, of course. And then the Virgin Mary's womb is referred to as the Ark of the New Covenant. The word ark itself is from a Latin word which means chest or box. The Hebrew word is tivah, which is connected to the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, meaning something closer to boat. So the Latin translation, which would come from the Greek, gives more of an idea of a holding device. The Hebrew version, more of a boat device. I personally think that ark, from arka or chest, strongbox, is a better term in my own opinion. All arks hold something precious or dear, but not all arks are boats. Moses' floating crib and Noah's Ark floated on the water, but they didn't have their own motive power on the water, which to me would be the big difference between a boat and just something floating down the waterway. A boat has a motive power, a sail, a propeller, something that makes oars or something that makes it go. An ark is just purely a device for holding things. The thing that connects all of those terms together is that they did hold something. In Moses' ark case, the ark held the infant Moses who would save his people from 400 years of bondage. Noah's ark held the remnants of God's creation to be rebuilt after the deluge. For Christians, Mary's womb as an ark held God-man, Jesus Christ. The Ark of the Covenant held just that, the covenant, the everlasting binding contract between Yahweh and his people. Of all the biblical arks or chests, the Ark of the Covenant was the most chest-like. Want to know about the Ark of the Covenant look like? Don't rely on me for a description. Moses recorded God's exact instructions on how to build a proper Ark of the Covenant. And this is from Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 to 22.
The Ark of the Testimony. And they shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and out you shall overlay it, and shall make on it a molding of gold all around. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in its 4 corners. 2 rings shall be on one side, and 2 rings on the other side. And you shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, that the ark may be carried by them. The poles shall be in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. And you shall put into the ark the testimony which I will give you. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work you shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end, and the other cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim at the 2 ends of it, of one piece with the mercy seat. And the cherubim shall stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be towards the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim, which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel.
You can see the directions are quite specific. And this is the place where God is going to personally hang out forever and ever. That's his seat, the mercy seat on top of the Ark of the Covenant that will hold these precious, most important documents you can imagine, the covenant that God's going to make with the people. Now we can talk about some measurements here because we've gotten a precise instructions on how to make the mercy seat, but the dimensions are a little iffy. A cubit was traditionally the length of the middle finger to the elbow of a man. That's a pretty convenient measure, just like palms, feet, spans, etc. Believe it or not, I'm sure you know it, they didn't have standardized measurements back then. A particular culture may have had standardization for each of these measurements, spans, feet, hands, cubits, but there wasn't a universal standard. With that, a cubit was in the average range of 18 inches or about half a meter, but it could be larger or smaller. Again, with that in mind, the ark would have been around 4 feet long or 120-ish centimeters. Not that small, but not that big either. Very portable. The ark stayed with the tabernacle and was placed in the Holy of the Holies, or the most sacred space, of course, because God's going to sit there. As a storage bin, the ark held a few key items, including, most importantly, the tablets of the 10 Commandments. There are so many threads we could chase with the 10 Commandments, but in short, the 10 Commandments marked the covenant or pact or contract between God and his people. The 10 Commandments weren't the only part of the deal, but they were a physical representation of the covenant. We saw a few episodes ago that it was common for peoples of that time and place to keep law documents in the sanctuary of their temples. That's a logical place to keep such documents. The laws gave the king legitimacy, and that legitimacy was connected into the holy or sacred way and then connected to the deities. That's huge. That connects everything in society together. The ark went to Shiloh with the tabernacle and was stolen by the Philistines, according to the Bible. Eventually, the Israelites got it back. The ark was housed in the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple, where it was pivotal in the Yom Kippur holiday, the most important of the temple holidays in the Israelite religion. So what happened to the Ark of the Covenant post-destruction of the second temple? Because there's evidence to show it in the second temple. That's a great question. You might ask, Steve. There are, and probably people out there, many people are asking the same question. So there are so many great stories and theories, but not a ton of direct evidence. There's some evidence to say it was in the second temple, but one thing against that, it wasn't represented in the Arch of Titus, which after the second temple was destroyed, Titus, the Emperor Titus, made a arch in Rome that depicted the destruction of the temple, all carved out, and many important artifacts were represented in that arch carvings of those particular items that were brought back to Rome. So we could, in a way, sort of infer that that's a list of items that they wanted to document. But there's no Ark of the Covenant in there. There's the candelabra, there's other things, but the Ark of the Covenant's not on there. And you'd think something solid gold item like that would be included, but it's not. There are a few theories, I dare say, conspiracy theories that say the Ark is still somewhere in Rome. Others place it in a monastery in Ethiopia. Some say it was discovered by the Knights Templar when their order was destroyed. And when their order was destroyed, the Ark went to France or Scotland, and then maybe even wound up in the United States. Maybe according to Indiana Jones, it's in a massive warehouse somewhere. Who knows? If I had to venture a guess, I would say that it never made it out of the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. And if that story in the Bible of the Philistines taking it is accurate, it may have never even made it out of that kidnapping situation, Grand Theft Ark situation. If we go back to the description, the box was literally worth its weight in gold. Something like that isn't going to just make it through too many lootings. But let's get back to the tent that housed the ark, the tent of meeting. What did the tabernacle look like, and what was it all about? So in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, God tells Moses to make the tabernacle, but before he gets into the details, and there will be details, he details 3 key items that need to be in the sanctuary of the tabernacle: the Ark of the Covenant, as we've discussed, the table or altar and the vessels for that altar, and then a lampstand. And this is the model for the classic lampstand we hear all about in the Hanukkah story, and that we see represented in the Arch of Titus. So Exodus chapter 26 is where we get into what God envisioned for his tent.
The tabernacle. Moreover, you shall make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine woven linen, and blue, purple, and scarlet thread. With artistic designs of cherubim, you shall weave them. The length of each curtain shall be 28 cubits, and the width of each curtain 4 cubits. And every one of the curtains shall have the same measurements. 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another, and the other 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another. And you shall make loops of blue yarn on the edge of the curtain, on the selve edge of one set. And likewise you shall do on the outer edge of the other curtain of the second set. 50 loops you shall make in the one curtain, and 50 loops you shall make on the edge of the curtain that is on the end of the second set, that the loops may be clasped to one another. And you shall make 50 clasps of gold, and couple the curtains together with the clasps, so that it may be one tabernacle.
This is just a few lines of what goes on and on and on in the text. How to construct or create every aspect of the tabernacle is detailed, including methods and materials. Then the next few chapters explain with some specificity how to make the garments for the priest, how to consecrate a priest, how to conduct the sacrifices in the tabernacle, and how to upkeep and maintain the tabernacle. Then we get to Exodus 31, verses 1 through 11. God even says specifically who he wants working on the temple project and who he wants to project manage the whole operation. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God and wisdom and understanding and knowledge and of all manner of workmanship to design artistic works, to work in gold, in silver, in bronze, and cutting jewels for setting, in carving wood, and to work all manners of workmanship. And I, indeed I, have appointed with him Aholiab, the son of Ahishamach, of the tribe of Dan, and I have put wisdom in their hearts of all the gifted artisans, that they may make all I have commanded to you. The tabernacle of meeting, the ark of the covenant, and the mercy seat that is on it, and all the furniture of the tabernacle and its utensils, the pure gold lampstand with all its utensils, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offerings, with all its utensils, and the laver and its base, the garments of ministry, the holy garments of Aaron, the priest, and the garments of his sons to minister as priests, and the anointing oil and sweet incense for the holy place, according to all that I have commanded you, they shall do. Moses is the project manager, and then you have these two craftsmen who are going to actually whip it all together. And I had just this speculation thinking right now, it's kind of interesting that God would pick somebody from the tribe of Judah and then somebody from the tribe of Dan when eventually the Israelites would settle into the Holy Land. Judah would have been the extreme southern tribe, and then Dan, if I'm not mistaken, was the most northern of the tribes. So maybe they're trying to capture an A to Z, an Alpha and Omega. The two most distant tribes are the ones who whip this whole thing together. In the end, we see that the tabernacle is more than just a tent for a religious revival. The Hebrews, or Israelites if you prefer, at least as the way they were depicted in Exodus, were people on the move. They were nomadic, but then they tapped into the nomadic lifestyle of not cheaping out on their accommodations, as we have seen with other nomadic people. They went all in on their tents. I think the bigger point is that the Israelites were creating the prototype for a temple for their tribe or nation. There's nothing different about the depiction of this tent than what would go into a proper temple, except for the permanency. Sure, a fixed temple would be made out of stone or wood, but the movable nature of the tabernacle didn't make any of the quality suffer. The very best materials that could be procured were used: gold, beautiful high-end wood, high-status fabrics, perfectly cut and polished jewels, top-of-the-line craftsmanship. The tabernacle could very well represent either actual or metaphorically the process of the Israelites evolving from worshiping in simple altars spread all throughout the land of Canaan to a proper temple-based worship. The Israelites are simple Canaanite pastoralists and early agriculturalists. They are the real deal, ready to be a part of ancient society by building a temple. They have the interest in building monumental architecture and the wealth that building and that sort of architecture shows a society has. The real end of this story of the tabernacle is that when Jerusalem was conquered and became the capital city, you might say, of the United Kingdom of Israel, everything changed for the Israelites. This is the point where the Israelites were a fully sedentary people that now needed sedentary institutions like a real national temple. King David danced and strutted his way into the city with the Ark of the Covenant, but it would be during the reign of his son Solomon, the last king of United Israel, to build the temple on the template of the tabernacle. Now that we've talked about Near Eastern temple building traditions and the mobile tent of meeting called the tabernacle, we can move on to the actual Temple of Solomon itself. First, we should talk a little bit about its builder, King Solomon. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. Known as a wise ruler, a great builder, and a man of immense wealth, Solomon's story is told in the biblical book of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. But what do we actually know about him from history? That's the question we're going to explore today. Solomon, whose name in Hebrew means peaceful, was also known as Jedediah, meaning beloved of Yahweh, and he was beloved of Yahweh. According to the biblical account, he was the son of King David and Bathsheba. Sheba, who King David ruled over a united Israelite kingdom. His reign was marked by political power, extensive trade, and military strength, and of course, legendary wisdom. He's credited with writing parts of the biblical books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Wisdom, but his most enduring legacy is his massive monumental building projects, including the grand first temple of Jerusalem, known as Solomon's Temple. But how much of this story is history? I think a lot of the listeners of this podcast would even start thinking, I'm not so sure about this. And we'll talk about how much is tradition that comes from the Bible. So let's so-called dig into the evidence. So what do we actually know about a historical Solomon? So we've talked about Solomon as he appeared in the Bible. He's wise, he's powerful, he's wealthy, he's militarily strong. But what about the historical record? What do we actually know about Solomon from sources outside of the Bible? A lot of scholars would just say, you know what, guys, the Bible is not a historical document. Clearly, the Bible, you pull your Bible off the shelf, it's not reading a history book as we would examine a history book today, but there's definitely chunks of history in there, and it gets to the point of what a people thought about either themselves and their history or what they felt about themselves at that time. But with that being said, things get a little tricky because there's no direct textual evidence, even or really direct archaeological evidence from outside of the Bible that confirms Solomon's existence. Unlike other major rulers, we don't have inscriptions or clay tablets of official records from Solomon's time mentioning Solomon by name. That doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't exist, but it does mean we have to rely on some indirect sources and some indirect evidence to build a historical picture of this guy. One of the strongest arguments for Solomon's kingdom being a major regional power comes from archaeology and specifically trade. We have evidence that the kingdom of Judah, which Solomon supposedly ruled over as a part of this united kingdom with the kingdom of Israel, was engaged in long distance trade with surrounding regions. There's an inscription from the 7th century BC, which would be several centuries after Solomon's supposed reign, which records trade between Judah and the kingdom of Saba in what is now the country of Yemen. In the Bible, Saba, known as Sheba, the kingdom of the famous Queen of Sheba, that is, while it isn't direct proof, like absolute pinpoint proof of Solomon himself, it does suggest that later Judean Judah kings and rulers maintained an economic connection with Arabia, which could have roots in an earlier period, maybe, possibly, kinda. And we can see that these trade routes, it's really how the trade routes operate very much today. Products from the East, now things are coming from China and India and you name it. But then the important, some seriously important products were coming from this Sheba, which is Yemen. And they go up the products would have very easily shipped straight up the Red Sea to really the southern tip, what we would call from the Bible, Edom, was right there, right smack dab there. And there was also land trade routes that went right into where Judah was. We've talked about this. There's even more evidence when we look at the copper trade. Archaeological digs at Timnah, which was a major copper production site in southern Israel, have uncovered signs of large-scale mining and trade networks. Copper was a key resource in the ancient world, which you mix it with a couple other things, tin, you name it, and you could get bronze, which bronze was the thing that it was kept this whole thing going, the Bronze Age. And if you could control production of copper, you could have a major source of wealth on your hands. Copper wasn't really the limiting agent of bronze. Tin was, and tin was a much more important element to control in that equation. And copper is a little easier to find, but still having solid, easily accessible copper is a big deal. Beyond metals, trade in high-value goods also played a role in Judah's economy. Excavations have revealed evidence of trade in fish, fruit, almonds, and luxurious purple-dyed cloth, items that were expensive and in high demand across the ancient Near East. If Solomon's kingdom really was involved in this kind of commerce, it could have been a very wealthy state. Maybe not quite as wealthy as the Bible describes, but still pretty awful wealthy. Now, Solomon loved him some monumental architecture. What king or medium-sized city mayor, is there really a difference, doesn't love monumental architecture? One of Solomon's most famous accomplishments, at least according to the Bible, was the construction of the first temple of Jerusalem. The biblical description paints a picture of a grand, gold-covered sanctuary built with cedar from Lebanon and adored with intricate carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. But is there any archaeological evidence to directly support this? Unfortunately, the site of the first temple is a major sticking point for historians and archaeologists. The Temple Mount is in Jerusalem, where Solomon's temple would have sat, and it sat basically on top of the second temple, which the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits right on top of. So this makes it really one of the most politically and religiously sensitive and controversial archaeological sites in the world. So that means archaeologists can't just go in there and dig and have large-scale excavations. It's just not possible. So it makes finding direct evidence that much more difficult. The archaeologists are basically sitting on a gold mine that they can't tap into. However, there is some indirect evidence that suggests Solomon's temple wasn't entirely out of place for its time. If you remember back a few episodes of the history of the Papacy, we discussed some well-adorned and well-attested temples in the ancient Near East, particularly in these areas of southern Anatolia and Syria. The two examples we talked about were the Tel Tayanat temple and the Ain Dara temple. These structures, built around the same general time period as Solomon's supposed reign, shared striking similarities with the biblical description of Solomon's temple, like really close. Beyond temples, there's also some evidence of large-scale construction projects in Judah during this time period. Archaeologists have uncovered fortified cities and defensive structures that align with biblical descriptions of Solomon's monumental building projects. For example, sites like Lachish, one of the key fortress cities of Judah, show evidence of significant construction with massive walls and gate complexes that fit with the idea of a kingdom investing heavily in its defenses. Before we wrap up, there is one more fascinating piece of indirect evidence we should talk about, not from archaeology or from trade records, but from art. In Pompeii, of all places, we find what might be one of the earliest iconographic depictions of a biblical scene, the famous story of Solomon's judgment. Now, this artwork was found in the house of the physician in Pompeii, and it appears to depict the well-known story that we all know and love from 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 24 through 27. So I'm going to read a little bit of it from the New King James Version.
Then the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other." Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, "O my lord, "Give her the living child, and by no means kill him." But the other said, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." So the king answered and said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother."
This artistic representation raises many questions of this really cool story. Was it inspired by Jewish communities in Pompeii? Was it commissioned by one of the so-called God-fearers who respected Jewish teachings but didn't convert? Or were early Christians involved somehow, some way? The depiction ultimately adds to Solomon's lasting influence, even in this unexpected place. It really, when I started to read about this, it was mind-boggling. It's like, how did they find out about this story? The Greeks were all into it. And what's kind of cool about this is it's kind of a side thing about the icon or picture, you might say, but there was pictures of Socrates and Aristotle, or what many scholars think was a little depictions of them kind of like listening in on what this great Solomon was getting at, which I think is very cool. The way they were depicted is very classically the way Aristotle and Socrates were depicted. What about Plato? I don't know why he doesn't get in the picture, but who knows? So really, to wrap up today's episode, in the end, what can we say about the historical Solomon? We've covered a huge range of evidence regarding Solomon, from biblical traditions to archaeological clues about trade, monumental architecture, and artistic depictions. While there's no direct proof of his existence, the economic and cultural context of his supposed times suggests Judah and maybe a combined Israel was a powerful and wealthy kingdom. Does that necessarily support the biblical account of Solomon, or say that it's the absolute truth and not watered down, or what we might call mythologizing, where later generations would mythologize a known character from their tradition? Were the biblical authors trying to pump up their own past to reflect a present that maybe wasn't so awesome? That is where we get into the trickiness of the Bible. It isn't a historical source in the way modern scholars would view one, but does any ancient writing really represent this ideal? And that's an honest question. My amateur self would say probably not. I'm just looking at this logically and practically speaking, and based on what I know. Most people couldn't read. Fewer people than that could write. And right there, we have a major issue. Writing material was extremely expensive. Writing materials were fragile and are fragile by their nature. What scholars have today as far as writing represents a tiny amount of the small amount of what was written back then and available. The people who were writing were performing an extremely time-intensive and expensive process. Something as precious and expensive as any purple-dyed cloth from the rotten remains of snails, bronze, or almonds, or any of these things that were passing hand to hand in trade back then. I think amateurs and experts alike should keep in mind when drawing conclusions. So with that, we've skipped over much of the biblical account of Solomon. That is an episode and really a series by itself. I bet you our old friend Gil will be on that pretty soon. We've only scratched the surface, but we see the context of Solomon. Let's shift our focus away from King Solomon to what happened after his reign as the king of the United Kingdom of Israel. We are now ready to dive into the historical and biblical context surrounding this legendary structure. In this episode, really our primary focus will be on exploring the story of Solomon's temple through the lens of the biblical account. We will also take a closer look at the archaeology and the historical evidence related to the temple's construction. Before we jump in, there are two important things to keep in mind. The biblical narrative about Solomon's temple isn't necessarily accurate history. It's a story shaped by religious, cultural, and political contexts. The archaeology of the area where Solomon's temple once stood is highly, highly obscured, and here's why. The exact date of the temple's construction isn't known. The Bible puts the building in the neighborhood of 900 BC. The temple itself was destroyed around 586 BC. Its location is well known, but the site was completely covered by the Second Temple of Jerusalem, which was built after the Babylonian exile. Later on, after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built on top of the site, which was in the 600s AD. With so many layers of history stacked on top of the sacred ground, archaeologists face a huge challenge in trying to uncover the remnants of Solomon's temple. And to make matters even more complicated, modern political tensions and instability in the region make it almost impossible for any sort of excavations to happen. With all this context and background in mind, let's explore the fascinating story of Solomon's temple. We'll blend the biblical narrative with historical and archaeological perspectives and build up those layers upon layers. So let's dig in. Building Solomon's temple, he had to gather a bunch of materials and a workforce. To understand the origins of Solomon's temple, we need to turn to our primary source for it, the Bible, specifically 1 Kings chapters 5 and 6. These chapters begin with the gathering of materials and setting up the divine building blocks of the temple. We start with 1 Kings chapter 5 with Solomon and Hiram of Tyre, or Tyre if you prefer. The story dives in with Solomon sending a letter to Hiram, the king of Tyre. Now, Hiram's an interesting figure. There are much later attestations of him, so it's unclear if he's actually historical or partly legendary. Nonetheless, he's portrayed as the king of Tyre, located in what is now southern Lebanon, a fascinating place with a rich history. Today, the area of Tyre, or as it's known in Arabic as Sur, is a beautiful beach destination, but in ancient times, Tyre was a powerful trading hub. The city itself was on an island off the Levantine coast in the Mediterranean Sea. Interestingly, it's no longer an island because Alexander the Great built an enormous causeway to conquer it. Now that city is connected to the mainland, and it's been that way for 2,000 odd years. Tyre's wealth came from its thriving trade network and abundant natural resources, including two really important exports. One, Murex Tyrian dye made from a specific type of Murex sea snail. This dye was known for its striking and luxurious color, making it an incredibly valuable resource. It was the color of kings. Purple was the color that kings desired the most because of this beautiful, rich dye. And then it was also known for Lebanon cedar. This is where things get really interesting and especially relevant to Solomon's temple. The cedars of Lebanon, known scientifically as Cedrus libani, are evergreen conifers native to the northern Levant. These trees have been celebrated just for centuries, with mentions even going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. So what's the big deal about these Lebanese cedars? Why were these trees so highly prized? It comes down to some of their remarkable qualities as a wood species. These trees have a beautiful wood with a good grain, making it really easy to work with them. The wood is harvestable in about 20-ish years, so not a really fast growing tree, but not bad compared to other trees. It also has a wonderful scent, and being a cedar, it's naturally insect repellent. It's also extremely durable and weather resistant, which makes it perfect for monumental construction. So really, it's no wonder why Solomon wanted these trees for his temple. Enough about trees, because I could just go on for days talking about trees. So let's move on. So anyways, in his letter, Solomon tells Hiram that Solomon that is now king of Israel and plans to build a temple. He requested a significant amount of cedar logs since there was a really limited wood supply resource in the hill country around Jerusalem. In return, Solomon offered to pay a handsome amount for those trees, likely in rough-hewn logs rather than finished lumber. Hiram, of course, agreed, sealing this alliance of peace and prosperity between his kingdom and Solomon's. But that's not the end of chapter 5. It even gets a little bit more interesting. To build a structure as grand as Solomon was envisioning for his temple, you need more than wood and stone. You need labor, and a lot of it. Here's how 1 Kings 5 through 13 from the New King James Version describes Solomon's workforce.
Then King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel. And the labor force was 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens, and 80,000 who quarried stone in the mountains, besides 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies, who supervised the people who labored in the work. And the king commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones, and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the temple.
This passage reveals that in addition to the wood from Lebanon, Solomon required an enormous labor force to gather materials, transport them, and construct the temple. But where did this labor come from? As a staple of ancient Near East and beyond, a system called corvée labor. So let's step outside of the temple construction site for just a moment or two and have a quick sidebar discussion of the corvée labor system. To fully understand how Solomon's temple and really most other monumental structures of the ancient world were built, we need to take a closer look at this labor system, corvée labor system. This isn't something most modern people are familiar with. Honestly, I didn't know much about it myself until I read Against the Grain by anthropologist James C. Scott, not to be confused with George C. Scott, legendary actor, who has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about today. The term corvée labor comes from the French word corvée, which means chore. Essentially, it was a system where people were compelled to work on public projects for a fixed period. This wasn't slavery in the traditional sense. Workers weren't owned by anyone, but they were required to perform labor as a part of their civic duty. When most people think about ancient monumental architecture, like say the pyramids of Egypt, they immediately imagine slaves, like Hebrew slaves being forced to build them. But this isn't exactly accurate, really not accurate at all. First off, the Hebrews almost certainly had nothing to do with the construction of the largest pyramids. Secondly, evidence now shows that these pyramids weren't built by traditional slaves, but by conscripted workers. These workers weren't property of the pharaoh, but were compelled to work for a set term. They would then return to their normal lives once their obligation was fulfilled. Now, if you're like me and lean a bit towards civil libertarianism, this might sound like slavery under a different name, but let's slow down and just think about it for a little bit. We can talk about corvée labor versus modern civil obligations. We all work in a compelled fashion for the government to some extent. It's called paying taxes. In the U.S., there's even a concept of something called Tax Freedom Day, the day when the average American has worked enough to pay all their local, state, and federal taxes. According to the U.S. Tax Collecting and Administrational Department, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, this is typically 99 days into the year. It's not that you only pay taxes 100% for 99 days, and then the rest of the year, you don't pay taxes. It's obviously taxes are spread throughout the year, but if this is assuming this tax freedom day is assuming you pay the first 99 days and then the rest is tax free, but you get the drift. In ancient Egypt, the situation was somewhat similar. Egyptian farmers could only work their fields for part of the year due to the Nile's flooding cycle. During the rest of the year, these farmers were available for other kinds of works like building monumental structures. Think of it as a draft system, but for construction instead of military service. That brings us to an interesting comparison. Is the corvée labor more like slavery or military conscription? In a military draft, people are compelled to serve in the armed forces of their country, but they aren't considered slaves. The term of service is fixed, and many draftees take pride in their contributions, even if they didn't volunteer or would not have served if they had not been compelled to join the military. Similarly, archaeological evidence suggests that corvée laborers took pride in the buildings they helped create. They saw it as fulfilling their societal obligation, not as being enslaved. Corvée labor was a blend of taxation, draft, feudal duty, and civic pride. It was also hierarchical. Certain individuals or groups could be exempted from service. Although there is a slippery slope into slavery, the line between corvée labor and slavery became blurred when the terms of service became indefinite or permanent. Conquered people or more marginalized groups such as rural hunter-gatherers could be forcibly conscripted as permanent labor, fully crossing the line into slavery. Corvée labor was also used in ancient Israel. This system wasn't not unique to Egypt and was widespread across the ancient Near East, including, of course, Israel. In the Ugaritic text, which we've discussed in previous episodes, provided evidence of corvée labor with terms ranging from anywhere from 2 to 60 days. In 1 Kings 5:28, Solomon required his laborers to work for 4 months at a time. The book of Nehemiah is also filled with examples of likely corvée labor being used to repair the walls of Jerusalem. Interestingly, not all workers were corvée laborers. In the later chapters of 1 Kings, a craftsman offers his services to create bronze works for Solomon. These skilled artisans were almost certainly paid, likely quite well. Monumental projects like Solomon's temple required both skilled and unskilled labor. Unskilled laborers such as farmers and shepherds with seasonal downtime were ideal for corvée labor. Skilled craftsmen, however, were in high demand and would have been compensated accordingly. And are we really different today? And today we have monumental architecture, and it relies on a society's shared resources, although we're no longer used as corvée labor. Public infrastructure projects are funded by tax dollars, requiring contributions from everyone in the community. In a way, this modern system isn't too far removed from the ancient practice of corvée labor. Understanding this labor system helps us appreciate the huge amount of human effort that went into building something like Solomon's temple. With the workforce organized and materials secured, the construction of this just monumental thing, Solomon's temple, could begin. So let's explore how the temple was built, brick by brick, or more accurately, stone by stone. So let's get to the completion of the dedication of Solomon's temple. Finally, the temple was finished. The monumental building project Solomon undertook came to a close, and this is described in 1 Kings chapter 6. So we'll quote a little bit of it from the New King James Version.
So Solomon built the temple and finished it. And he built the inside walls of the temple with cedar boards. From the floor of the temple to the ceiling, he paneled the inside with wood, and he covered the floor of the temple with planks of cypress. Then he built the 20-cubit room at the rear of the temple, from floor to ceiling with cedar boards. He built it inside as the inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. And in front of it, the temple sanctuary was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with ornamental buds and open flowers. All was cedar. There was no stone to be seen.
The description really captures this grandeur and intricate craftsmanship of Solomon's temple. Every inch of the interior was covered in rich cedar, carved with detailed designs of flowers and buds of flowers and all that. No stone was actually visible inside, despite all the amount of stone quarried and used for the structure itself. And this depiction aligns with the classical temple designs we've discussed before, which clear connections to the Eindara and Tel Tayanat temples, the layout, ornamental details, material choices. All of this reflect this Near Eastern architectural influences of the time. And so it was in the text, it says it took 7 years to build. Maybe it took 7 years to complete from basically laying the foundation to the finishing touches, but did it really take 7 years? No, maybe not. In ancient Hebrew, the number 7 symbolizes completeness and perfection. So the 7 years might, and probably more than likely, to build the temple was seen as the perfect amount of time to make the perfect house for the Lord, rather than a precise construction timeline. And now it's time to move in. Let's get this party started. Once the temple was complete, it was move-in time. Chapter 8 of 1 Kings describes the grand procession as the sacred items were transferred from the tabernacle, that old tent of meeting we discussed, into the new temple. This included the Ark of the Covenant and the law tablets, which were placed in the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. This wasn't just about logistics. This was about legitimacy. In the ancient times, law codes were often kept in temples to signify their divine authority. Housing the law tablets in the temple did the same for the Israelites and their laws. It tied in this divine origin and the cultural importance of all of that. So it's always time when a king or even a small town mayor has a finished construction project, it was time for some grand speechifying, Solomon style. After the sacred items were moved in, Solomon addressed the assembly. Here's an excerpt from his speech in 1 Kings chapter 8, 14 through 21, again from the New King James Version.
Then the king turned around and blessed the whole assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel was standing. And he said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who spoke with his mouth to my father David, and with his hand has fulfilled it, saying, Since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have chosen no city from any tribe of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. Now it was in the heart of my father David to build a temple for the name of the Lord God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, Whereas it was in your heart to build a temple for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the temple, but your son, who will come from your body, he shall build the temple for my name. So the Lord has fulfilled his word which he spoke. And I have filled the position of my father David, and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised. And I have built a temple for the name of the Lord God of Israel. And there I have made a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord which he made with our fathers, when he brought them out of the land of Egypt."
Whew, that was quite a speech. Short and to the point, maybe a little verbose. Solomon's speech emphasized continuity, linking himself to his father, King David, and to the covenant made with Moses and the Israelites. By doing so, he positioned himself as the rightful leader, fulfilling divine promises and ensuring political stability. After his speech, Solomon dedicated the temple and made the first sacrifices. And when I say sacrifices, I mean a lot of sacrifices. So many that the bronze altar, the main one, wasn't big enough to handle them all, so they had to perform some of these sacrifices outside. The dedication feast lasted 7 days, followed by another 7 days, 14 days in total. Again, using this 7 reinforces the idea of perfection and completeness. And now that is a party that any medium-sized mayor spending billions of dollars for sports stadiums used for a few months out of the year should throw for his people or hers. As I read this chapter of Kings, I had a question, and I bet you did too. Where are all the priests? One interesting detail is the absence of priests in this part of the narrative. There's no mention of high priests or any priestly rituals. It's Solomon's show. He's the one giving the speeches, blessing the assemblies, leading the dedication ceremony. In this context, Solomon is portrayed as a priest king or a king priest, uniting political and religious authority. This is significant because it reflects the centralization of power in ancient Israel. By assuming both kingly and priestly roles, Solomon wasn't just building a temple, he was solidifying his authority over both the religious and political spheres of his kingdom. In the descriptions in the book of Kings, we are seeing how Israelites viewed themselves and the building of their monumental temple. It wasn't just the Israelites who actually did the building work. This was the view of the Israelites writing this book of Kings half a millennium later in a very tumultuous time of their own. Maybe the Bible didn't pass muster for a proper historical book, but the narratives sure sound like a realistic, if not 100% accurate portrayal. But that's something we always have to keep in mind with the Bible. The Bible's not telling, like most other ancient histories and ancient descriptions, there's more to it than just telling a factual story. You've got to get across a certain message. And that's clear that this is what this book of Kings was trying to do from this book from the Old Testament. This isn't the end, but just the end of the beginning. We've explored the biblical account of the planning, construction, and dedication of Solomon's temple. We've also looked at other building practices of the ancient Near East, including how labor and materials were organized. We'll follow the story of Solomon's temple through its major renovation and its eventual destruction. The first temple stood for centuries, but time, neglect, and political upheaval took their toll. Several kings undertook renovations to restore and maintain the temple. We'll shift our focus to what happened after Solomon. The first temple stood for centuries, but time, neglect, and political upheaval took their toll. Several kings undertook renovations to restore and maintain the temple, each leaving their mark on this sacred site. We examine how these renovations reflected the religious and political struggles of their time. Let's dive into the history of the first temple's restoration. Solomon's temple stood for nearly 500 years, a remarkable feat for an ancient structure in such a tumultuous region. Throughout its history, the temple endured periods of glory, neglect, and even desecration. While its longevity is impressive, it didn't remain unchanged. According to the Old Testament, 3 kings, Joash, Hezekiah, and Josiah, undertook renovations to restore and maintain the temple. However, the reigns of Ahaz and his son Manasseh complicate this picture. The renovations of Ahaz and Manasseh are usually seen as not such great renos. They are more like when that owner of a stately old house paints over the beautifully stained woodwork, laid linoleum flooring over the hardwoods, tore out the pocket doors, and sided the house with the cheapest, ugliest asbestos siding known to man. Some of these kings' efforts were celebrated, while others were condemned. Their renovations reflected more than just the condition of the temple. They reveal the religious and political struggles of their time. In the next few sections, we'll explain each of these rulers and the impact that they had on the house of the Lord our God. Let's look at Renovation 1.0. The first recorded need for the temple being renovated came in the wake of destruction, though exactly who was responsible and how much damage was done remains a matter of debate. According to the Bible, Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt plundered Jerusalem and despoiled the temple. This pharaoh is often identified with Shoshank I, the Libyan ruler who founded Egypt's 22nd dynasty. Egyptian records, particularly the Bubastite portal at Karnak, confirm that Shashank led a military campaign in the southern Levant. However, whether he actually sacked Jerusalem itself remains controversial. Some scholars argue that Shashank's campaign focused on other cities and that biblical accounts of his attack on the temple may be exaggerated or even completely historically uncertain. Not to make things even more complex, another possible source of damage comes from within Judah itself. The biblical accounts suggest that Queen Athaliah, the grandma of King Joash, looted the temple during her rule. While the text primarily describes her actions as religious desecration, it also raises the question of whether she also caused some structural damage. By the time of King Joash or Jehoash, the temple was in clear need of repair. 2 Kings 12 describes his efforts to restore it. Though the focus is less on the actual repairs and more on the financial funding and disbursement difficulties than the actual repairs required and then made. The biblical account details how funds were collected but initially mismanaged, which leads to further delays. Further complicating this history is the so-called Joash inscription, a stone tablet found near the Temple Mount all the way back in 2001. The inscription describes repairs to the temple in language similar to the biblical narrative, which seemingly confirms the accounts in Kings and Chronicles. However, the Israeli Antiquities Authority declared it a modern-day forgery, and its authenticity remains highly disputed. This period is a tangled mix of archaeology, textual evidence, and historical interpretation. Whether the temple was truly damaged by Shashank, Athaliah, or both, or whether it needed repairs at all, is still debated. What is clear is that Joash saw the need to restore the temple, marking the first recorded attempt to repair Solomon's temple. Judah was a kingdom in crisis in the late 700s to 600s BCE. So this period from the mid-700s to the mid-600s BCE was a real roller coaster for Judah, Israel, and the Near East. The three kings, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and Manasseh, ruled Judah from roughly 735 to 642 BCE, though the exact dates vary depending on how biblical scholars interpret the historical and biblical accounts. What is clear is that Judah, like the rest of the region, was caught in a storm of political and religious upheaval. This was the era of the rising Assyrian Empire, a military powerhouse that reshaped the whole political landscape. The northern kingdom of Israel and its capital, Samaria, fell to the Assyrians, and Judah found itself increasingly vulnerable. Territory was lost, and the once strong kingdom was reduced to little more than a vassal state. While Judah technically remained independent for a few more decades, the writing was already very much on the wall, to quote a prophetic voice a few books later in the Bible. Judah's days as a sovereign kingdom were numbered. Beyond the political struggles, this was also a period of deep religious tension. A fierce battle played out between those who pushed for more pure Yahwistic monotheism and those who sought to blend Israelite traditions with Assyrian religious practices. King Ahaz and his grandson Manasseh took the path of accommodation, adopting elements of Assyrian religious traditions to maintain favor with their powerful political overlords. Their changes were less about physical renovations of the temple and more about modifying religious practices, aligning the kingdom's worship with Assyrian expectations, and perhaps securing Judah's survival in the process. Stuck right in the middle of this struggle was King Josiah, who would later emerge as a major reformer and temple restorer. Unlike Ahaz and Manasseh, Josiah pushed back against foreign religious influences, making sweeping changes to religious practices and launching significant temple renovations. His reign marked a desperate attempt to restore Judah's religious and national identity in the face of mounting external pressures. This internal conflict within Israelite religion played out in the biblical texts, where fiery prophets called for a return to that strict old monotheism, while other leaders promoted religious syncretism. The Bible serves as our primary source for understanding these debates, but as always, questions remain. Are these passages a reflection of contemporary struggles, or do they represent later interpretations of the past? What is certain is that this period laid the foundation for the most significant temple restoration yet, one that Josiah would lead an attempt to reclaim Judah's religious heritage and strengthen its national identity. But in the midst of all this chaos, one king would rise, not to compromise, but to cleanse, restore, and rebuild. Josiah would not only renovate the temple, but attempt to reshape the very soul of Judah itself. Caught in between the reigns of his father, Ahaz, and his son Manasseh, two kings with really different versions of Judah. But let's put Josiah aside for just a moment, and let's talk about that one stuck in the middle, Hezekiah. So he was caught in between the reigns of his father Ahaz and his son Manasseh. So two kings with really different versions of Judah. Hezekiah ruled during a time of incredible pressure. The Assyrian Empire loomed large, threatening not just Judah's borders, but its identity, while Ahaz had leaned in the compromise, and Manasseh would later swing even harder towards compromise and assimilation. Hezekiah tried to chart this middle path, resisting foreign domination while reinforcing Judah's spiritual foundations. Hezekiah's reign was marked by crisis and resilience. His resistance to Assyria was only partially successful. While he managed to hold on to Jerusalem, the vital stronghold of Lachish fell. Assyrian king Sennacherib couldn't take the capital, but he left Judah fractured and humiliated. In the famous Taylor Prism, Sennacherib described Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, trapped and helpless, and yet Jerusalem stood. Hezekiah is one of the most well-documented kings of Judah, both in biblical and extra-biblical sources. I often use Hezekiah and Sennacherib as a teaching point for my students. Both claimed victory, Hezekiah in the Hebrew scriptures and Sennacherib in his royal inscriptions. So who really won? In many ways, both did. Sennacherib failed to capture Jerusalem, but succeeded in turning Judah into a client state. Hezekiah didn't achieve full independence, but he did preserve the kingdom. History isn't a scoreboard. Both sides were fighting for different objectives, and both met their goals partially. As I said, I often use Hezekiah and Sennacherib as a teaching point with my students. Both claim these massive victories in their respective accounts. Hezekiah in the Old Testament, Sennacherib in his cuneiform inscriptions. Could they both be right? Who won? Who lost? In essence, they both did. History in life isn't a sports game. Different people can fight for different goals. Sennacherib set out to crush Judah and secure the trade routes running through his territory. While he didn't conquer Jerusalem, he did succeed in turning Judah into a vassal kingdom. Hezekiah, meanwhile, wanted to keep Judah free from total conquest. Jerusalem wasn't taken, and the kingdom did survive, albeit very diminished. So both sides achieved parts of their aim while falling short of others. Who do you think was the big winner? Put your thoughts in the comments section, especially like and subscribe to this channel on YouTube. And when it comes to the temple, Hezekiah's renovations were less about architectural embellishments and more about these religious transformations. His first move was to tear down the high places, rural altars and mini temples where people had long worshipped, and this was no small act. Hezekiah wasn't just streamlining worship, he was centralizing it. All sacrifices, all devotions, all religious authority were to flow through Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Hezekiah's second renovation was more practical, but also more painful. In a desperate effort to appease Sennacherib, he stripped the gold from the doors of the temple. It was really a humiliation, a physical and symbolic cost of vassalhood. Still, this moment is framed in the biblical text, not just as a payment, but part of a broader effort to purify and sort of reset the temple. The books of 2 Kings describes a cleansing of the temple, removing foreign idols, restoring proper worship, and bolstering the Levitical priesthood. Perhaps more symbolically, Hezekiah reinstituted the Passover and invited the remnants of the northern tribes already conquered by Assyria to come to Jerusalem, participate. It was controversial, bold, and deeply political. It was a sort of unite the clans move, trying to bind a fractured people through shared worship and shared memory. In the end, Hezekiah's renovations weren't just about bricks, beams, or gold. They were an attempt to reinforce Judah's spiritual core, to repair not only the temple, but the very idea of a chosen people, set apart and rooted in a covenant that still had meaning, even though it was under threat. Still, Hezekiah's reforms were just the beginning. Josiah would pick up the mantle with even greater urgency, leading to a sweeping campaign to not only repair the temple, but to define the faith and the future of Judah itself. Now, if Hezekiah was a reformer trying to hold the line, Josiah was a revolutionary set on drawing a new one. His reign marked the most ambitious and dramatic religious reform in the history of the First Temple, and it all began with the major building project. The book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 34, verses 8 through 12 tells us,
in the 18th year of his reign, when he had purged the land and the temple, he sent Shaphan the son of Azaliah, Messiah the governor of the city, and Joah the son of Joahaz the recorder, to repair the house of the Lord his God. When they came to Hilkiah the high priest, they delivered the money that was brought into the house of God, which the Levites who kept the doors had gathered from the hand of Manasseh and Ephraim, from all the remnant of Israel, from all Judah and Benjamin, and which they had brought back to Jerusalem. Then they put it in the hand of the foreman who had the oversight of the house of the Lord, and they gave it to the workmen who worked in the house of the Lord, to repair and restore the house. They gave it to the craftsmen and builders to buy hewn stone and timber for beams, and to floor the houses which the kings of Judah had destroyed. And the men did the work faithfully.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. You can't ask for a better reno project than that. It went smooth as silk. In the end, Josiah wasn't just patching up a structure. He was symbolically rebuilding Judah's covenantal identity. His reforms were sweeping and aggressive. He purified the temple, tore down high places, removed idols, and reinstituted the centrality of Jerusalem as the sole location of proper worship. This was more than political maneuvering. It was a whole religious reset. The funding came not just from Judah, but from the remnants of the northern tribes, Manasseh, Ephraim, and beyond. The work wasn't just centralized. It was collective. The people were invited into the reinvestment, literally and spiritually, and to do that into this temple and their shared identity. For Josiah, the temple renovation was the physical manifestation of a theological mission to restore faith, unity, and obedience in the face of a fractured and really fading out kingdom. Josiah's renovation wasn't just stone and wood. It was a call to return. Whenever I've lived in an old house, I always held out hope that I'd find some hidden artifact stashed behind a wall, a newspaper from a century ago, maybe even a little forgotten heirloom tucked into a stud or something like that, or a gap in the wall. I found a few old curiosities here and there, but nothing special. Definitely nothing historic. Josiah, though, he hit the mother lode. In the midst of his temple renovation, something remarkable happened. While the workers were working around doing a little this and that, just the usual routine stuff, the high priest Hilkiah stumbled upon something that would change everything, as recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, verses 14 to 15.
Now when they brought out the money that was brought into the house of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. Then Hilkiah answered and said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan.
This wasn't just some old book. It was the book, the Mosaic Law, a long-lost foundational text forgotten or hidden in the temple itself and rediscovered the very moment Josiah was trying to revive the nation's spiritual heart. In one stroke, Josiah's renovation project went from a national religious reform to something way bigger. It became a covenantal reawakening rooted not just in tradition, but in this rediscovery of the sacred law. Man, what I would have given to find something awesome like that behind some old drywall in my house. The biblical text at the very least shows that what Hilkiah found that day wasn't just any old religious scroll. It may have been the book of Deuteronomy itself. If that's true, the timing couldn't have been more perfect for Josiah. He wasn't just looking to spruce up the temple a little bit. He was leading a full-blown religious movement, reform movement, that is. And now, right on cue, comes the original law code of Moses. That's a game changer and a convenient one at that. But Josiah and his officials didn't just take the scroll at face value. They needed to confirm its authenticity, its authority. So who do you turn to? A wise old prophet? Surely. Someone deeply respected in religious circles? Of course. And yes, they did. But maybe not the person you'd expect. They went to Huldah, a prophetess. Huldah's name only appears in two places in the Bible, in the books of Kings and Chronicles, and only in connection to this event. We don't get much backstory, no elaborate introduction. She isn't a household name like, say, Isaiah or Jeremiah, but in this very moment in the text, she was the only one they trusted to interpret the text and speak on behalf of the Lord. And Huldah confirmed it. The book was genuine and its message was urgent. Judgment was coming, but Josiah's heart and repentance had delayed it. The reforms must continue and the covenant must be renewed. It's quite interesting that it wasn't a wise man that the guys went to immediately verify their find. It was a woman and a prophetess. In the middle of construction dust and political tension, a forgotten scroll and a little-known prophetess helped shape one of the most profound spiritual pivots in Judah's history. With the rediscovery of this law book in hand, Josiah wasted no time at all. He launched what would become one of the most sweeping religious reforms in the history of Judah. The newly found text didn't just confirm his mission, it gave it direction and urgency. One of Josiah's first major acts was to reinstitute the proper observance of Passover. According to the biblical account, it hadn't been celebrated like this since the day of the Judges. This wasn't just about the ritual. It was a recentering of Judah's identity around its covenant history. The temple, Solomon's temple, would once again become the singular and sacred place of worship and sacrifice. All other sites, high places, local shrines, regional altars were all shut down. Josiah made it clear worship would be centralized in Jerusalem, but he didn't stop there. 2 Chronicles chapter 34:24 tells us that Josiah got rid of mediums, spiritists, the household gods, and the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem. It was a full-scale purge of anything that didn't align with the newly reaffirmed law of Moses. Now, we have to acknowledge something important here. Our only source for these events are the books of Kings and Chronicles. There's no independent records outside of the biblical narrative to confirm these sweeping changes. So, whether every detail is historically accurate or not, what matters is how the writers of these texts wanted the story remembered. They wanted to see a turning point, a king who tore down the altars, cleared out the idols, and called the people back to that old religion, that old covenant. Whether it happened exactly this way or not, Josiah's legacy in the biblical tradition is clear. He was a king who tried to rebuild not only the temple, but the religion of the people. Josiah's reforms may have marked a high point in Judah's spiritual life, but they couldn't stop the political collapse already gathering speed. The last king of Judah died in the battlefield at Megiddo, fighting against the Egyptians. With his death, the stability he had tried so hard to restore unraveled rather quickly. In the years that followed, 3 of Josiah's sons and a grandson would take turns at the throne, but none could hold the kingdom together. Around 586 BCE, the end did come. The Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar swept in, conquered Jerusalem, and brought the kingdom of Judah, and with it the first temple period, to a violent close. It could have been the end of the story. That's what happened to countless other peoples conquered by the great empires of the Near East. They vanished from history, absorbed and erased, but not the Judeans. For them, this wasn't the end. It was the end of an era, yes, but it also marked the beginning of something new. Nebuchadnezzar may have reduced Solomon's temple to rubble, but the identity, faith, and the story of the Jewish people would continue to grow, shaped and challenged and transformed in exile. And that's the story we'll explore next. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. I am your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for joining me today. Previously, we traced the long and complex story of the First Temple's renovation and religious reforms, from the earliest damage possibly inflicted by the Egyptian pharaoh through the piecemeal repairs under Joash and the dramatic religious centralization efforts of Hezekiah, and then big sweeping reforms of King Josiah. We followed the ups and the downs of a sacred space that served as the religious heart of the kingdom of Judah. Josiah's death at Megiddo was not just the fall of the reforming king, it was the beginning of the end for the kingdom itself. The spiritual renewal he tried to ignite could not stop the geopolitical tsunami that swept across the entire ancient Near East. Right now, we're going to turn to the final days of the First Temple. We will explore the destruction of Solomon's great structure and then the unraveling of the monarchy of Judah, the conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonian forces under King Nebuchadnezzar, and then just dip a little bit into the aftermath. This was not just the collapse of a building, it was the collapse of the world for the Judahites. And yet, out of the ashes, something unexpected began to take shape. Let's get into the story of how the First Temple fell and what came next. From Assyria to Babylon. So we talked about some of the external pressures facing the Judahite kingdom. Egypt always loomed to the southwest, while to the east, kingdoms and empires from Mesopotamia had long played a major role in shaping the politics of the region. You had Egypt and Mesopotamian empires just always crashing into each other, and the logical place for them to crash together was in the southern Levant. In 722-ish BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Judah was nearly swept away as well, but under King Hezekiah, the kingdom managed to just hold on by the tip of its fingers. Hezekiah fought back where he could and bribed the Assyrian king Sennacherib to keep some measure of autonomy, even if it meant accepting vassal status. The Assyrians were a known quantity by then, a dangerous quantity, but familiar. We ended previously with the death of King Josiah at the hands of the Egyptians at the Battle of Megiddo. That marked a real turning point. The end was nigh, and it was not just the old enemies Judah had to worry about. By this point, the Assyrians were no longer the dominant force in Mesopotamia. A new empire had emerged, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Powerful, ambitious, and eager to control the same trade routes and strategic lands that had once been part of the Assyrian Empire's sphere of influence. So let's take a moment to see where this new power came from and how it would ultimately bring Solomon's temple to the ground. Decline, fall, and rise of many empires. Right now, we're standing on the eve of Jerusalem's destruction and the fall of Solomon's temple at the end of King Josiah's reign. It's been nearly 3/4 of a century since the days of Hezekiah, and in that time, the geopolitical map of ancient Near East has shifted dramatically. The once mighty Assyrian Empire was gone. Completely gone, wiped off the map, and almost erased from the historical record. Their downfall came at the hands of a coalition led by the Babylonians and supported by the rising Indo-Iranian peoples, including the Persians, the Scythians, and the Medes. I would like to get into these Indo-Iranian groups more and maybe another time. Suffice it to say, they were a tough people and powerful warriors. And they're eventually going to take over the show, but that's again another story for another day. These new powers brought old school fire and fury to Nineveh and other Assyrian centers, leaving little behind but ruins and memories. Why did the Assyrian Empire fall, you may ask? Historians still debate it, as they debate everything. Some point to their infamous cruelty, which may have made them more enemies than allies, especially among their vassal states. Others suggest they were militarily overextended, stretched too thin across too many borders, or maybe, as it's often the case in Mesopotamia, it was simply time for the next empire to step in and call shamat, or checkmate. However it happened, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was now in control, and it is the second king of that empire who concerns us today, Nebuchadnezzar II. This is the same Nebuchadnezzar who may have commissioned the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of Herodotus's so-called 7 wonders of the ancient world. If the gardens did indeed exist. Whether or not he built the gardens, there's no doubt he was a master of building and conquest. Nebuchadnezzar worked to secure and expand the gains of his father, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian state, and a key part of that strategy involved campaigning in the Levant. That meant crushing resistance. That meant Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar is the king who ordered the destruction of Solomon's temple. He is the one who exiled the elites of the Judahite kingdom to Babylon, an event that would completely reshape Jewish identity forever. He was a conqueror for sure, but also a visionary builder. The biblical writers had their own perspective on the man, as we well know. So next, let's look at Nebuchadnezzar and then the destruction of Jerusalem through the lens of the biblical narrative. And as you might expect, the reviews of Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible were not exactly glowing. Let's get into some history in the Bible. Many of you will get the reference in this section's title, a little nod to our dear friend Gary Stevens and his History in the Bible podcast. If you want to take a much deeper dive into the Babylonians and their place in the biblical narrative, especially the events surrounding the destruction of the first temple, listen to Gary's podcast that I also highly recommend. Another great source, which is Gil Kedron's A Podcast of Biblical Proportions, which offers a thoughtful, layered analysis of these stories from fresh and unique angles. The Babylonian Empire truly was an empire of the Fertile Crescent. At its height, if you were to overlay a map of its territory over the Fertile Crescent, the two would match almost perfectly. In the region of Judah, the boundary between the Neo-Babylonian Empire and Egypt practically lines up with the modern-day border between the modern nation-states of Israel and Egypt. Geography may change names, but power struggles tend to trace the same old roots. In the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar is portrayed as the ultimate baddie, and honestly, who can blame the biblical writers for that? From their perspective, he destroyed not only their capital city, but the very house of their God. Solomon's temple was gone, the priesthood scattered, and the people exiled from the land they believe they had been divinely promised. Of course, they saw him as the enemy par excellence, but the historical record paints a broader picture. Nebuchadnezzar was respected as a military strategist, a builder of monumental architecture, and a ruler who brought vast wealth into Babylon. His empire, from a Near Eastern perspective, was successful and stable under his rule. Still, that is not how the Israelites saw it. It is their perspective recorded in the book of the Old Testament that we will take a peek at next. The beginning of the end. After Josiah's death, the cracks in the kingdom of Judah widened fast. His son, Jehoahaz, became king, but not for long. According to both the books of Kings and Chronicles, Jehoahaz had a very short reign because he was deposed by the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Egyptian influence over the region was still strong, and this was the first of several rapid successions in the throne. Jehoahaz was replaced by his brother, Jehoiakim, and here's where things get a little messy with names. Jehoiakim reigned for about 11 years, at least according to the books of Kings. Neither Kings nor Chronicles paints a flattering picture of him. Both texts seem to go out of their way to highlight just how bad he was, especially in contrast to how awesome Josiah had been. He was remembered as a weak king, spiritually backward and politically vulnerable. During Jehoiakim's reign, the pressure from the outside powers grew unbearable. Both Egypt and Babylon were chipping away at the Judahite kingdom. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jehoiakim and took him in quote-unquote bronze fetters or shackles. This was not just a symbolic humiliation. The Babylonians raided the temple again. Sacred vessels, treasures, and the physical heritage of the temple worship were all taken. We are now deep into the final act of this story. Now follow closely because the names do not get any easier. Jehoiakim with an N at the end, or just to make things a little less confusing, he was also known as Jeconiah, became the next king. Chronicle says he was 8 years old at the time when he took the throne. King says he was 18. Let's get into a little deep dive of Jeconiah's age differences between Kings and Chronicles. I don't know, I went down a little rabbit hole of a Reddit and then a wider internet search on this one. It's not the highest grade academic research, I know, but it was definitely entertaining. Some people take this as the so-called gotcha moment, pointing to it as clear evidence of a contradiction, major contradiction in the Bible. That obviously causes issues for anyone who holds Bible to an inerrancy level. Others argue that one of the numbers is just a scribal error, basically an ancient typo. And then there's a third group that suggests a more nuanced theory that Chronicles may have recorded Jeconiah's age when he had become co-regent or vice king, possibly ruling alongside his father, Jehoiakim, while Kings recorded his age when he became full king after his father's death, after his father was taken into bondage into Egypt or died, one or the other. Whichever explanation you prefer, one thing is clear: Jeconiah's reign was brief, very brief. He was quickly taken into captivity by the Babylonians. In many ways, Jeconiah was the last true king of Judah. He was the final monarch who had held any claim to real sovereignty, even if it was short-lived, and it was kind of a vassal status. What came after him was a little more than just the final collapse, when the floor just completely fell out. This is the end. This is about as bad as it gets. With Jeconiah taken into exile, Nebuchadnezzar installed a new ruler in Jerusalem, the last surviving son of Josiah. His name was Mattaniah or Matanyahu, but the Babylonians gave him a new name, Zedekiah. It was a reminder of who was really in charge. He was not the king in the traditional sense. He was more of an ethnarch, a puppet leader placed over a tiny, weakened rump state. Zedekiah had one of the greatest prophets of all time at his side, that is, Jeremiah. But unfortunately, he did not take Jeremiah's advice. Gil Kedron, in A Podcast of Biblical Proportions, does a great job unpacking the politics of Jeremiah. And if you want to go into a much deeper dive into that story, he even came on to the History of the Papacy podcast to give an overview of his series. Look for links in the show notes for that. For our purposes here, what matters is that Zedekiah stood at a crossroads and he chose a path that led straight to ruin. At this point, our sources, Chronicles, Kings, and now the book of Jeremiah, start to diverge slightly in how they explain what happened next. Kings gives us a short, blunt explanation. Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. That's it. One line. Chronicles is even vaguer, giving us very little detail about why Nebuchadnezzar decided to act. Jeremiah, however, offers us a bit more. According to the prophet, Zedekiah began to make moves in aligning himself with Egypt, perhaps hoping the old rival of Babylon could offer some military support. It didn't work. The Babylonians would not tolerate rebellion from a client king, especially not one flirting with Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar responded with force. He laid siege to Jerusalem. At first, there was hope. The Egyptians did show up. For a moment, it looked like they might actually even help, but they were defeated and driven back by the Babylonians. The siege resumed. The walls held fast for a while, but the end was coming. The Babylonians broke through, sacked the city, and destroyed everything, including Solomon's temple. And with that, we move into the final act, the last stand of Zedekiah, the fall of Judah, and the utter devastation of the house of God that Solomon built from the ashes. The final blow was devastating, both physically and symbolically. The fall of Jerusalem was not just the end of a city, it was the collapse of a worldview. The book of Jeremiah gives us one of the most chilling accounts of what happened in the aftermath of the siege. So this is a quote from chapter 9 of the book of Jeremiah, verses 6 through 10. We read,
Then the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes in Riblah. The king of Babylon also killed all the nobles of Judah. Moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with bronze fetters to carry him off to Babylon. And the Chaldeans burned the king's house and the houses of the people with fire and broke down the walls of Jerusalem. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive to Babylon the remnant of the people who remained in the city, and those who defected to him, with the rest of the people who remained. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left in the land of Judah the poor people who had nothing, and gave them vineyards and fields at the same time.
It's hard to imagine a more thorough and deliberate dismantling of a kingdom. Now, to be fair, the Babylonians probably did not kill all the nobles of Judah, but they certainly killed many of them, enough to eliminate the leadership class and to severely break the leadership class. Zedekiah's fate sealed the deal. He would see his sons executed before him. Then he was blinded and taken away into chains. No more king, no more crown, princes, no more resistance. In place of a monarchy, the Babylonians appointed a governor to oversee what remained. The new province was called Yehud. It was no longer an independent kingdom. It was a conquered land administered by imperial officials. The Babylonians carried off the best and brightest, the aristocracy and the merchants and the scribes, the craftsmen, anyone who had influence or could be useful in the empire. This was not an act of random cruelty. It was a standard imperial policy. You remove the power base and resettle it to serve your needs elsewhere. And that's exactly what they did. As for the temple, Solomon's temple, it was gone, ransacked, burned, reduced to rubble. The place where heaven and earth were believed to meet, where generations had worshiped, sacrificed, celebrated the Passover, and the Day of Atonement was no more, gone, poof, just gone. And just like that, the first temple period was over. And what does archaeology say about all this? When it comes to the physical remains of Solomon's temple, we run into one major and reoccurring difficulty. As we mentioned before, the original first temple is believed to be buried beneath the second temple complex, which was later destroyed by the Romans. On top of all of that sits the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, active religious sites that are central to Islam. And then everything else then you have the modern city of Jerusalem that's sitting all over the place and all around the Temple Mount. That means archaeology has serious limits. Access to the site is restricted for religious, political, and cultural reasons, and understandably so. With all of that in mind, there is very little, and according to most mainstream scholars, no visible archaeological evidence of Solomon's temple today. Of course, not everyone agrees with that conclusion. A few tantalizing artifacts and architectural fragments have been claimed to be from the first temple, but these claims are hotly debated. Most notably, the Israel Antiquities Authority does not support these assertions. The Israel Antiquities Authority, or IAA, is a government agency of the modern state of Israel. Its mission is clearly stated.
The Israel Antiquities Authority will serve as the leading professional body for the study of the archaeology of Eretz Israel. It will preserve, conserve, and study the archaeological heritage of the country at the highest scientific level, and will maintain a balance between development needs and antiquities preservation.
What matters most here is that the IAA's scientific posture is extremely conservative, not in the political sense, but in the scientific one. They don't rush to declare biblical confirmation based on fragmentary or ambiguous findings. And in a field as emotionally and religiously charged as biblical archaeology, that kind of caution is super necessary. In today's world of headlines and clickbait, the incentive to overhype any artifact is overwhelming. We see this again and again. Small scraps of parchment, a fragment of pottery, or a misinterpreted inscription get paraded around with the headlines like, "Proof Jesus did X," or "This disproves the entire Bible." A prime example, which we've covered in detail in this podcast, is the so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife fragment promoted by Karen King. That episode stands as a cautionary tale. A huge portion portion of the academic community bought into a sensational find that in hindsight had all the red flags of a forgery. It should have been stopped much earlier in the process. That is why you need organizations like the IAA. They act as brakes. Maybe they go too far sometimes, and maybe some real discoveries get slowed down in the process. But when dealing with the archaeology of the Bible, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in my opinion, at least, it's far better to err on the side of caution than to spark another wave of misinformation or so-called fake news. Now, there are a few tantalizing theories floating about what might still remain of Solomon's temple. These views fall well outside of the academic mainstream, but they continue to circulate in both popular and scholarly fringe circles. Some of this is admittedly massive conjecture. One of the core arguments goes like this. There was no practical reason for Nebuchadnezzar to completely dismantle the physical foundation of the temple. Tearing down stone walls and foundation blocks in the ancient world would have been a massive job. It was labor intensive, time consuming, and ultimately just unnecessary. The destruction of sacred objects, the ark, the garments of the priests, ceremonial vessels, and of course the looting of the temple's wealth would have sent the message loud and clear. In that light, some scholars argue that parts of the original foundation might have been left intact simply because there was no reason to destroy them. That idea has led to a lot of discussion, especially about a particular section of masonry along the current Temple Mount that looks, according to some, just out of whack with the rest of the Herodian or Second Temple construction. The theory goes that when Herod built the Second Temple, he had to conform to something that was already there, possibly a section of Solomon's temple that had survived. It's really an intriguing thought, but every time I read through one of these articles or papers, the number of what you might call presumablys and may-haves just keeps stacking up. The logical leaps become wider and the evidence thinner. I'm no archaeologist, and I'm certainly not a trained scholar of ancient architecture, but I do know what logical twisting and logical twister looks like. A lot of these arguments rely on speculation layered over more speculation. That does not mean they are definitively wrong, but it just means we have to be super careful, especially as laymen and amateurs. Curiosity is good. Confirmation bias dressed up as discovery is something else entirely. And so the foundations of Solomon's temple, if any remain, are still shrouded in mystery, buried not just beneath stone, but beneath centuries of faith, politics, hope, and just building. And with that, we have the end of the beginning. With all that, we come to the end of this episode and the close of our journey through the life, renovation, and destruction of Solomon's temple. We began with a building project, a house for the Lord built at the height of Israel's united monarchy. We followed the temple through times of neglect and revival, kings who defiled it and others who tried to save it. Joash repaired it, Hezekiah reformed it, Josiah tried to restore it to its original glory, but the walls still came down. The city burned. The people were taken into exile, and yet the story did not just end there. The destruction of the first temple marked the end of an era, but also launched a time of deep spiritual transformation. It forced new questions, new answers, and eventually new traditions that would shape the future of Judaism and the Israelite religion. In a way, a brand new Judaism, an entirely new thing that was rooted in past tradition would come about. Second Temple Judaism. The Second Temple Judaism was the genesis, if you will, of Christianity. Christianity, rabbinical Judaism, and even eventually down the line Islam. As we wrap up this series, I want to thank you for coming along on this journey, but we're just getting started. Thank you guys so much for listening to this special series and documentary on the history, renovation, and destruction of the First Temple. I truly appreciate you spending your time with the History of the Papacy podcast. If you enjoy this documentary style format, I'd love to hear your feedback. What worked? What didn't? And what would you like to hear more of in future series? If you'd like to support the show and help get us to our goal of 100% listener funding, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Just a few dollars a month makes a huge difference, and there's great perks like early content, book giveaways, and inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs. There's many other ways to support the show too, including just liking this video and subscribing to us on YouTube. Buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com and many other ways. Check them out in the show notes, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next series.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.